Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity gets comfortable, history settles in beside us, and the stranger corners of the real world are given enough quiet to be properly noticed. Tonight, we are heading to Cleveland, to the edge of Lake Erie, and to one of those weather events that sounds exaggerated, until you start reading the details and realise that, no, the atmosphere really did behave like that. Our subject is the Cleveland Superbomb, the Great Lakes blizzard that seemed to turn from a bad winter storm into something far more serious in what felt like a single night. By the time many people understood what had happened, roads were disappearing, familiar streets had lost their shape, wind had taken over the sound of the morning, and ordinary plans had become completely useless. It is the sort of story that begins in a way most people recognise. A workday coming, errands waiting, coffee being poured, radios muttering in kitchens, somebody glancing out of a window and deciding the weather looks unpleasant but manageable. Then, not very long after, the whole scale of the day changes. That is one reason this storm has stayed in memory so firmly. It was not just large, it was disruptive in a very personal way. It arrived with the kind of force that makes routine collapse all at once, and that tends to leave a mark. The blizzard that hit Cleveland and much of Ohio on January 26, 1978, was tied to a rapidly intensifying storm over the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, with severe winds, record or near-record low pressure in the region, and widespread paralysis across transportation and daily life. Before we get into it, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the weather is doing there right now. Is it cold where you are? Is it still? Is there rain on the windows, or one of those ordinary nights where nothing much seems likely to happen at all? A story like this always makes me think about how quickly a place can go from familiar to difficult. You can stand in your own neighbourhood, know every corner, every sign, every shortcut, every patch of pavement, and then one hard turn in the weather comes through, and suddenly the same place starts behaving like somewhere else entirely. It is still your city. It is still your street, but it no longer plays by the same rules, and that realization tends to arrive faster than anyone would prefer. And if you find this kind of quiet journey soothing, interesting, or simply a good way to slow your thoughts down at the end of the day, I would be very grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this small, calm corner reach more people who enjoy winding down with stories that are real, strange, and just detailed enough to keep the mind occupied without pushing it into overdrive. There are worse ways to end the day than sitting with a historical blizzard, especially one dramatic enough to earn a name like Superbomb, which sounds less like a weather system and more like a title somebody in a 1970s disaster film would say with great seriousness while pointing at a map. Now, when people talk about famous storms, there is often a temptation to flatten them into a few neat images. Deep snow, closed roads, a lot of wind, maybe a photograph of a buried car. Those things matter, of course. But weather disasters are not just made of measurements and headlines. They're also made of little interrupted moments. A bus that never arrives. A nurse trying to work out whether she can make it to a hospital shift. A parent deciding whether school will close and whether the children's boots are where they're supposed to be. Someone at a gas station wondering whether to keep driving or turn back. Someone else saying, perhaps too confidently, that it will probably blow over. Weather becomes history through people first, and through statistics second. That is especially true with winter storms in the Great Lakes region, because people there are used to winter. Snow on its own is not enough to impress Cleveland for long. Cold is not news. Wind off the lake is not a shock. A lot of residents in that part of the country grow up with the practical habits that winter teaches. Keep the tank from running low, own better boots than you think you need, give yourself more time than the map claims. Scrape the windshield fully even when you are tempted not to. Listen to forecasts but also look outside because the sky has a way of making its own argument. Places like Cleveland do not panic just because January behaves like January. That is part of what made the blizzard of 1978 so memorable. It was not a case of a city meeting winter for the first time. It was a case of a winter city getting hit by something that pushed well past the point of normal confidence. Cleveland's 1978 blizzard is remembered locally as one of the worst in the city's history, with the storm deepening dramatically and bringing sustained winds over 50 miles per hour, gusts above 80 miles per hour, intense blowing snow, and a record barometer reading in the city. There is also something unsettling about storms that intensify while people are sleeping. A thunderstorm in the afternoon feels visible. You watch it build. You hear the first rumble. You see the light change. But a system that strengthens in the dark has a different kind of effect on the mind. Evening gives you one impression. Morning gives you another. Between those two moments, while most people are indoors and off guard, the situation reorganizes itself. The pressure falls. The wind field shifts. Colder air drives in. Roads that were merely wet or messy become hostile. Visibility goes. The world that many people wake into is not the world they went to bed expecting. According to National Weather Service summaries, rain and fog were common in parts of the region. On the evening of January 25, 1978, before Arctic air and severe winds surged in overnight, producing full blizzard conditions by the early morning of January 26th across much of Ohio, including northeast Ohio and Cleveland. That overnight turn matters because it tells us something about how weather is experienced by ordinary people. Forecasts can warn. Meteorologists can explain pressure patterns and fronts and deepening lows. Some people pay close attention, many do not. Most are trying to get through a normal day. They're doing laundry, they're setting alarms, they're deciding what to wear in the morning. And so the actual emotional beginning of a disaster is rarely the formal meteorological start. It is the moment the average person realizes the day they assumed they were going to have has been cancelled by reality. You can imagine Cleveland on the evening before, a January city by the lake, not cheerful exactly, but functioning. Lights in houses, cars moving, restaurants open, television on in living rooms, somebody probably saying the weather looks rough for tomorrow, somebody else saying they still have to get to work either way. That is how these things usually sound beforehand. Cautious, practical, mildly annoyed. Human beings are very good at fitting warnings into the frame of what they already expect. If you're used to winter, then a winter warning gets translated through habit. It becomes, leave earlier, dress warmer, be careful on the roads. The possibility that the day might become nearly unworkable often arrives later, and not because people are foolish, but because normal life trains us to assume that most disruptions stay within manageable range. And to be fair, most of them do. Most storms are not historical storms. Most miserable commutes are simply miserable commutes. Most bad forecasts produce inconvenience rather than legend. That is one reason people sometimes underestimate the exceptional event. Experience teaches resilience, but it can also teach a little too much confidence. A person who has made it through 10 ugly winter mornings may assume the 11th will be just another one with slower traffic and colder fingers. Then the atmosphere decides to stop cooperating with precedent. The phrase weather bomb or bomb cyclone gets used widely now, sometimes with more enthusiasm than precision, but the basic idea is real enough. It refers to a storm that intensifies very rapidly, with pressure dropping fast over a relatively short period. In the Great Lakes context, that can become especially dangerous because strong pressure gradients, cold air, existing snow cover, and lake influences can combine into conditions that are far worse than snowfall totals alone would suggest. The blizzard of 1978 was notorious not just for snow, but for wind, pressure, blowing and drifting, and the way it shut down movement. It was the kind of event where the atmosphere stops being scenery and starts acting like infrastructure has offended it personally. Meteorological accounts of the 1978 storm emphasize its rapid deepening, exceptionally low central pressure near the Great Lakes, and the role of intense winds in creating blizzard conditions and crippling travel across Ohio and surrounding states. When a storm like that strikes, snow is only part of the problem. Snowfall sounds measurable and straightforward. 8 inches, 12 inches, more in some areas, but wind turns snow into something far less tidy. It moves it, piles it, strips one area bare and buries another, takes a road and removes its edges, takes visibility and reduces it until distance becomes guesswork. People who have never been in a true whiteout sometimes imagine it as simply very snowy, as though it is just ordinary snow with a dial turned up. It is not. A whiteout can erase depth and direction so completely that familiar surroundings become unreliable. The road, ditch, shoulder, median, sidewalk and field can lose their differences. And that is how a storm starts trapping people quickly, not because everyone makes absurd decisions, but because even sensible decisions require a visible world to operate in. That point will matter a great deal as we move further into this story, because one of the most haunting things about the Cleveland Superbomb is how quickly ordinary motion turned into immobilization. Cars became shelters, then problems. Freeways became holding areas for stranded people. Plows faced conditions that were not simply difficult but often nearly impossible to get ahead of. Emergency response depended on people who were themselves trying to move through the same blizzard as everyone else. In storms of this kind, the system does not fail for one dramatic reason. It clogs from every direction at once. Still, before the roads vanish and the wind begins its long argument with every exposed surface in northern Ohio, there is a quieter thing worth noticing. Cities build their routines on trust, not deep philosophical trust, practical trust. The roads will probably remain roads. The workday will probably function. Stores will probably open. The bus will probably come. Heat will probably stay on. The basic structure of an ordinary day depends on thousands of assumptions so normal that they are almost invisible. Severe weather exposes those assumptions by damaging them one by one. It is one of the reasons weather stories can feel so intimate. They do not just threaten buildings and vehicles, they reveal how dependent daily life is on systems working in sequence. This is where the Cleveland story becomes especially compelling, because it sits at the meeting point of meteorology and routine. You have a rapidly intensifying storm over the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, yes. You have plunging pressure and severe winds, yes. But you also have a very regular American winter weekday about to collide with it. That is what gives the event its texture. It is not only about what the atmosphere did. It is about what happened when that atmosphere met alarm clocks, commutes, school systems, hospitals, radios, phone calls, side streets, snowplows, kitchen tables, truck drivers, and the quiet assumption that tomorrow morning will be difficult but navigable. That assumption did not last. By the morning of January 26th, blizzard conditions had spread across Ohio, and transportation breakdown was severe enough that the Ohio Turnpike closed, while wide areas of normal travel and daily activity were effectively paralyzed. There is also Lake Erie sitting there at the top of the picture, which any Cleveland weather story ignores at its own risk. The lake does not create every winter problem in the city, but it shapes the character of many of them. People in Cleveland understand that the lake is not just scenery. It is a weather partner, and not always a cooperative one. It influences temperature, snow bands, wind and mood, and on winter days it can make the air feel sharper and the city more exposed. So when a major storm develops in the broader Great Lakes region, the setting itself already carries a certain tension. The geography has experience with hard winter weather. That experience is useful, but it does not guarantee comfort. By now, you may have noticed that storms of this kind are remembered partly through numbers and partly through stories people tell afterward. They tell you where they were, what they thought when they first looked outside, whether they were stranded or called off, or stuck at work or trying to get home or unable to reach someone they loved. That is how a blizzard settles into local memory. Not as one clean event, but as thousands of overlapping accounts that all begin with some version of the same sentence. It got bad very fast, and that phrase, very fast, is the real hinge of tonight's story. Not because no one had warning, there were warnings, not because winter itself was unusual, it was not. but because the speed with which conditions shifted from unpleasant to dangerous changes the whole tone of a city's day. It turns planning into reacting. It turns confidence into improvisation. It turns local familiarity into a limited resource. And for a storm to earn a name that still gets repeated decades later, that transformation has to be strong enough that people do not merely remember the facts. They remember the feeling of having the day taken away from them. So as we ease further into Cleveland in late January of 1978, it helps to picture the city before the real collapse of conditions, not yet buried in drifts, not yet caught in full whiteout, not yet listening to the wind as though it has become the main fact of existence. Just a winter city with all its ordinary moving parts still in place. People going to bed, some uneasy, some unconcerned, some half listening to the forecast, some not listening at all. The lake cold, the road still there, the night underway, and out across the wider region, the storm already reorganizing itself into something much stronger than many people would fully understand until morning, when Cleveland would begin discovering piece by piece that this was no ordinary snow day and no routine blast of Great Lakes weather, and that the city they knew so well was about to look completely different by breakfast. Cleveland in late January is not a city that needs to be introduced to winter. It knows what lake wind feels like on the side of your face. It knows the sound of a shovel hitting packed snow. It knows the small daily negotiations that cold weather brings, like whether the car will start cleanly, whether the side streets were ploughed properly, whether the walk to work will be brisk or miserable, and whether the weather report is describing a nuisance, a headache, or something worth changing plans for. Snow itself is not enough to impress a place like that for very long. A grey morning, a cold windshield, slush along the curb, boots drying by the door, these are not exceptional things. They are part of the local grammar of winter, understood without much discussion. That familiarity matters because it changes the emotional shape of the story. If a severe storm strikes a place unaccustomed to snow, the tension begins with novelty. In Cleveland, the tension begins somewhere else. It begins with confidence, not reckless confidence, not denial, just the ordinary belief that winter can be handled because winter is always being handled. People still get up. They still go to work. Stores still open. Trucks still move. Coffee still gets poured before dawn. The city does not stop every time the thermometer makes an unfriendly decision. By January of 1978, Ohio had already been in a hard winter season, with deep snow on the ground in many places and conditions that residents would have recognized as part of a rough Midwestern year, rather than a strange interruption from some alien climate. So, before the famous morning arrives, there is a quieter picture worth holding on to. A city still inside routine. A city not relaxed exactly, because winter rarely allows complete relaxation, but still organised around the assumption that tomorrow will be a normal working day with extra layers. Downtown office buildings will light up. Buses will try to keep to their schedules. Hospital staff will make their shifts. Factory workers will head in while it's still dark. Schools will be watched carefully, but not yet treated as impossible. Radios will be on in kitchens. People will stand at windows for a second longer than usual, assessing the street in the way people do when weather has become part of the morning decision-making process. What makes this part of the story interesting is how ordinary that confidence would have felt. Human beings do not wake up every day expecting to become part of regional weather history. They wake up thinking about lunch, commutes, errands, and the immediate practical problem nearest at hand. There might be a mention of the forecast over breakfast. There might be a little grumbling about snow tyres, salt, or the drive to work. Someone might say it looks like a rough one out there. Someone else will answer that January always looks rough. In places shaped by winter, experience creates a useful toughness. It also creates habits of interpretation. People become skilled at sorting weather into categories: manageable, annoying, dangerous but familiar. Likely to improve by afternoon, likely to make traffic ugly. It takes a truly unusual event to break through that framework. Cleveland in 1978 was also a city with heavy routines built into it. This was a working city by the lake, with industrial rhythms, shift changes, freight movements, school schedules, local television forecasts, and the dependable march of weekday obligations. Even when a storm is coming, the machinery of ordinary life does not instantly back away from the curb and surrender. It keeps moving until something forces it to stop. That is one reason major blizzards produce such vivid memories. They do not simply arrive in empty space. They arrive in the middle of payrolls, deliveries, appointments, family plans, and work alarms that were set the night before under the assumption that the world would remain negotiable by morning. And Cleveland had every reason to think of itself as negotiable in winter. Lake Erie could make weather sharp and messy. Northeast Ohio dealt regularly with snow bands and lake effect surprises. Streets could be difficult, yes, but difficult is not the same thing as unworkable. Cold weather in that part of the country tends to produce a sturdy realism rather than melodrama. You wear the heavier coat, you scrape the windshield properly, you leave earlier. You complain a little, because that is part of the ritual, but then you go. Even the phrase bad weather can mean a wide range of things in a place accustomed to enduring it. There is also the question of scale. A city experiences winter through thousands of small domestic acts. A mother putting mittens where they can be found in the morning. A man checking the front steps before bed to see whether they are already icing. A landlord turning up heat in an older building. A store owner listening to the late forecast and wondering if customers will bother to come in. These are not dramatic actions, but they are how weather enters lived experience. Meteorologists see fronts, pressure falls, air masses, and wind fields. Households see whether the boots are still wet from yesterday. Both are real. One explains the event. The other explains what it feels like to be there before it becomes memorable. On the evening of January 25th, 1978, much of the region was not yet buried beneath the full force of the blizzard conditions people would remember. In many areas, rain and fog were widespread that evening, and temperatures were generally in the 30s and 40s before the real surge of Arctic air and high wind arrived overnight. Blizzard warnings had been issued across much of the Great Lakes and Upper Ohio Valley by late evening, but the atmosphere still had one more turn left to make before dawn. That detail is important because it changes the psychology of the night. Rain and fog do not always feel like the beginning of a legendary blizzard. They feel messy. They feel inconvenient. They feel like weather that might become snow later, or weather that might leave behind a sloppy commute. The danger in a rapid overnight transition is that ordinary sensory cues can be misleading. If someone looked out a window at 10 in the evening and saw wet streets and low visibility, they might reasonably assume the next morning would be unpleasant. They would not necessarily imagine a statewide shutdown, stranded vehicles, and a city learning in real time that the day had become something else entirely. The National Weather Service later described the storm as striking before dawn on January 26th and disrupting transportation, business, industry and schools across Ohio for days. That is one of the most unsettling things about storms that intensify in darkness. Afternoon storms let people witness the build. They can see the sky change. They can listen to reports while still awake and adjust with some sense of continuity. Overnight deepening behaves differently. People go to sleep in one set of conditions and wake into another set of rules. The most dramatic changes occur while the city is trying to rest. By the time alarm clocks go off, the atmosphere has already revised the terms of the day. And still, for most of that evening, Cleveland would have been doing what cities do. Traffic lights cycling through their colours, night shifts beginning, televisions glowing in living rooms, kitchen tables being cleared, school clothes perhaps set aside for the next morning. There is something almost unfair about the normalcy of those moments when placed next to what comes after. They make the storm feel less like an abstract force of nature and more like an intrusion into ordinary life. Disaster is often remembered this way, not only for its violence, but for how abruptly it interrupts things that had seemed solid an hour earlier. The city itself would have looked entirely recognisable. Streets, bridges, parking lots, storefronts, lakefront structures facing into the cold, familiar neighbourhoods going about their separate versions of the same winter evening. Cleveland had seen bad weather before and would see it again, but there are moments before a major event when a place seems almost stubbornly itself, as though routine can hold through anything. That is part of what makes the transition so striking later. Nothing appears theatrical at first. It is just Cleveland, in January, being Cleveland. Then there is the lake. Lake Erie is never merely a decorative backdrop in these stories. It is part of the local weather character, part of the reason the region reads the sky differently from places farther inland. Residents know that the lake can help shape the kind of cold that settles over the city, and the sort of snow that does not always distribute itself politely. They may not speak in the language of meteorological models, but they understand that weather near the lake has a habit of becoming personal. A forecast in northeast Ohio is not always a straightforward statement. Sometimes it is more like a warning that local geography has opinions. Even so, local knowledge has its limits. Familiarity with snow does not equal immunity to rare combinations of wind, pressure, and timing. A city can be seasoned and still be overwhelmed. In fact, seasoned places can sometimes be especially vulnerable to the early stages of disbelief, because they have learned to function through conditions that would stop other regions cold. A Cleveland resident is not likely to panic over the first signs of winter trouble. That composure is practical and admirable. It is also why the truly exceptional storm has a way of arriving one step ahead of expectation. Across the wider Midwest and Great Lakes, the system involved in the blizzard of 1978 was not an ordinary winter low just drifting through. Meteorological summaries describe a rare merger of systems and a rapidly deepening low-pressure centre that reached its lowest pressure over Cleveland. The pressure at Cleveland Hopkins fell to 28.28 inches, which was described as a record low for the city and, in state summaries, the lowest atmospheric pressure ever recorded in Ohio. Those numbers sound technical, but they matter because pressure is not just a figure tucked inside a weather archive. It tells you the atmosphere is reorganizing itself into something powerful. It tells you the air is setting up steep differences that can drive violent wind. It tells you the storm is not simply passing through politely. Something is intensifying. Something is tightening. Something is preparing to make every exposed object in the region feel the force of that change. The city, of course, does not experience this as a neat pressure graph. It experiences it through rattling windows, shifting forecasts, and that growing sense that tomorrow morning may not fit the usual pattern after all. But even then, usual pattern dies slowly. People still tend to measure risk through the stubbornness of duty. If you have a job that expects you in, you assume you will try. If children are meant to go to school, you prepare as though they might. If your route to work has been ugly before, you remember that you made it before. Human beings are creatures of precedent. We lean on yesterday to judge tomorrow. That works wonderfully until tomorrow decides to become historically rude. The city's infrastructure would also have encouraged that bias toward continuity. Cleveland was not a fragile outpost waiting to be blown over by the first bad forecast. It was a major metropolitan area with plows, road crews, police, hospitals, factories, shipping interests, and all the layered systems of a place used to difficult winters. There is comfort in that. Systems are reassuring. They suggest capacity. They suggest that no matter what the weather does, someone is already dealing with it. And in many storms that is true enough. Crews go out, roads are treated, schools close if needed. The machine adapts. The problem with the blizzard of 1978 is that the machine itself was about to be forced into conditions that outran normal adaptation. That becomes clearer when wind enters the picture. Snow can be ploughed, cold can be endured, but intense wind changes the geometry of the problem. It strips and piles, reduces visibility, creates drifts faster than crews can clear them, and turns roads into uncertain spaces rather than maintained surfaces. Strong winds aloft were able to mix down because of the cold air moving in, and later National Weather Service reviews noted regional wind gusts in the 80 to 100 mile per hour range during the storm. In Ohio, the result was not just snowfall, but blizzard conditions severe enough to shut down movement on a wide scale. And yet, during the city's last ordinary hours before that full transition, daily life would have gone on with all the unremarkable details that later seem almost tender in memory. A late bus, a supermarket receipt, a thermos set out for the morning, factory clocks, someone deciding not to refuel until tomorrow, someone else deciding to top off the tank just in case. These are the tiny forks in routine that weather history is built from. A person can make a completely reasonable decision at 9 in the evening and discover by 6 in the morning that reason has been revised by the sky. There is something else to notice here too. Cities do not experience oncoming weather evenly. Some people have the luxury of caution, others do not. A salaried office worker may be able to delay, a hospital employee may not. A parent of small children reads the forecast differently than a college student with nowhere urgent to be. The same winter evening contains many different thresholds of concern. For some, the storm is interesting. For others, it is logistical. For others still, it is already a threat to the next day's income, safety, or obligation. That layered reality is always present in severe weather, but it becomes especially sharp in retrospect once the scale of the event is known. By the time Ohio was fully in the grip of the blizzard on January 26th, transportation, business, schools, and much of ordinary movement were shut down so extensively that the state's normal pace did not return for several days. The Ohio Turnpike closed, widespread travel became impossible, and the combination of blowing snow, cold, and wind created deadly conditions across the region. Knowing that outcome gives the evening before a strange quality. The city is still functioning, but the future version of it is already on its way. Cleveland, as usual, is on borrowed time without knowing it. The roads still look like roads. The plans still look like plans. The alarms are still being set. But out across the broader weather map, the elements that will break routine apart are already lining up. The low is deepening. The temperature structure is changing. The pressure gradient is tightening. The cold air is preparing to move in with force. From the point of view of the people inside homes, cars, restaurants, and night shifts, none of that arrives as theory. It arrives as a morning that does not resemble the one they expected. One glance outside, perhaps, then another longer glance. A radio turned up. A phone call. A decision to leave now rather than later, or not leave at all, or leave and regret it. That is the hinge the story turns on. A city between winter and routine can live with a great many things. Cleveland could live with cold, with snow, with the lake making trouble, with forecasts that sounded unpleasant. What it was about to meet was not winter in its familiar working form. It was winter pushed into a different register by an explosive storm system, and the next step in the story is the atmosphere itself, because before streets vanished and cars froze into place, the weather first had to become the kind of weather that could do all that. A storm does not need to be a hurricane to behave with alarming speed. In meteorology, the phrase bombogenesis refers to a mid-latitude storm that intensifies very rapidly over about a day. NOAA explains it as a storm whose central pressure drops fast enough over 24 hours to qualify as explosive strengthening, and that kind of pressure fall is what tells forecasters the system is organising into something much more powerful than an ordinary low. In plain terms, the lower the pressure gets, the stronger the storm tends to become, because the atmosphere starts pulling air toward that centre more aggressively, and stronger movement of air usually means stronger wind, sharper fronts, and a faster change in conditions on the ground. That is the first important point with the Cleveland storm of January 1978. It was not simply a snowy day that happened to be windy. It was a rapidly intensifying cyclone, the sort of system meteorologists study because it grows with unusual force and speed. National Weather Service summaries for the blizzard describe it as the result of an explosive intensification of a surface low moving north from the Gulf Coast into Kentucky and Ohio, and the storm's pressure fall was extreme enough that some barographs had to be readjusted because the pressure dropped beyond the original chart scale. That is the kind of detail that sounds almost comic until you stop and think about what it means. The instrument was effectively saying, "This storm is operating outside the range we were calmly prepared for." The second important point is that storms of this kind usually do not come from one neat ingredient. They form because several pieces of the atmosphere line up at the same time, and in this case the lineup was unusually efficient. National Weather Service accounts describe a relatively rare merger of two distinct upper-level waves, one over Texas and one over the northern plains, helping intensify a surface low that was already moving north from the Gulf region. Another official review from the Detroit office described the event as beginning with two smaller but distinct storms, one associated with an Arctic air mass entering the northern plains, and another low developing over the eastern Texas and Louisiana area. So from the start, this was not one simple storm strolling in from one direction. It was a complicated setup in which separate pieces of weather began cooperating in exactly the wrong way. That cooperation mattered because each piece brought something useful to the growing system. The southern storm helped provide moisture and a track toward the Ohio Valley. The northern setup brought very cold air and the machinery needed to sharpen the storm structure. When forecasters talk about a storm feeding off contrasts, this is usually what they mean. Warm air and cold air sitting near each other create a kind of stored tension in the atmosphere. The stronger the contrast, the more energy a storm can sometimes draw from it, if the larger pattern is arranged properly. January 1978 had already been a notably cold winter over much of the eastern half of the country, and the National Weather Service in Detroit described strong Arctic plunges diving south and meeting warmer air from the deep south throughout that season. In other words, the ingredients were not subtle. The continent had already set the table. Then there were the jet streams overhead, which is where the story stops sounding like a routine winter forecast and starts sounding like the atmosphere had recruited management. A jet stream is a fast river of air high in the atmosphere, and storms often strengthen when they are positioned beneath especially favourable jet patterns. For the blizzard of 1978, the Detroit National Weather Service office described two distinct jet streaks aloft, becoming the key to the storm's later strength and massive extent. A strong Arctic impulse diving south across the western United States, and a subtropical jet impulse moving across the southwest. Those two powerful branches of the larger North American jet structure phased together over the southeast, creating a merged wind maximum of about 150 knots aloft, which helped induce rapid intensification of the low as it surged north. That is meteorology's way of saying the storm found itself under an exceptionally strong upper air support system at exactly the wrong time and place. This is one of those places where the science can sound abstract unless it is translated into ordinary terms. Think of the storm at the surface as something trying to lift air upward and reorganize the weather beneath it. If the air high above is arranged in a way that helps remove mass from the top of the developing system, pressure at the surface can fall faster. That fall in pressure helps the cyclone strengthen. The stronger cyclone pulls in more air. The stronger air movement sharpens temperature differences and fronts. The whole process can begin feeding itself for a while. Meteorologists do not describe this as magic, of course, but if you were standing in Cleveland the next morning, you could be forgiven for feeling that the atmosphere had made several unfair decisions in a row. The official summaries of the 1978 storm repeatedly point to the phasing of upper-level features and the rapid deepening of the surface low as the central reason the blizzard became so severe. Pressure is the easiest way to see that intensification on paper. Cleveland's barometric pressure fell to 28.28 inches, which remains the lowest pressure ever recorded in Ohio, according to National Weather Service event summaries. The 1978 National Weather Digest paper by Thomas Blackburn put that Cleveland reading at 957.7 millibars and noted that it was 0.40 inches lower than the previous city record, which is a massive break for a location with long-term observations. Across the storm's path, many places set all-time record lows, and Blackburn also noted 3-hour pressure falls and rises so extreme they were probably record-setting for inland extratropical cyclones in much of the contiguous United States. These are not small statistical curiosities. They are signs of a storm deepening with extraordinary speed and then moving through with equally dramatic pressure changes around it. That is why the phrase weather bomb fits this event better than it fits many storms that get the label in casual conversation. The storm's central pressure fell about 40 millibars in 24 hours, according to National Weather Service histories from Detroit. NOAA's explanation of bombogenesis gives the commonly cited shorthand definition as a drop of at least 24 millibars in 24 hours for explosive strengthening, with the exact threshold varying by latitude. This 1978 storm was not barely slipping across the line. It was strengthening far beyond the popular benchmark. So when later retellings call it a bomb cyclone, they are not leaning only on dramatic language. They are describing a storm that intensified rapidly enough to satisfy the technical idea behind the term in a very convincing way. Still, rapid deepening by itself does not tell you how a place like Cleveland actually ends up trapped in a blizzard. Plenty of strong low-pressure systems bring rain, thunderstorms, or mixed precipitation without becoming legendary winter disasters. For a blizzard, timing and air mass arrangement matter just as much as raw storm strength. During the evening of January 25th, rain and fog were widespread in Ohio, and temperatures were mostly in the 30s and 40s. That is not how many people picture the beginning of one of the worst blizzards in state history, but that was the setup. Then, early on January 26th, an Arctic air mass pushed in behind the storm, temperatures plunged rapidly, and the precipitation changed over while winds increased sharply. In Ohio, blizzard conditions spread from southwest to northeast during the early morning hours and reached Cleveland by around 7 a.m. That timing is crucial because a storm becomes more dangerous when different hazards arrive in sequence instead of all at once. First, the storm was deepening. Then the warm sector weather of rain and fog created a false sense that this was messy rather than catastrophic. Then the Arctic front arrived with force. Temperatures fell 30 degrees in 2 hours in some areas of Ohio, according to the Cleveland National Weather Service summary, and the cold air moved in fast enough to change the character of the entire event before most people had a chance to adapt. Blackburn's 1978 paper likewise emphasised that a very cold air mass to the west was rapidly drawn into the storm's circulation and likely played an important role in intensification, while 6-hour temperature drops exceeded 25 degrees in parts of Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. So the blizzard was not simply a snowstorm becoming stronger. It was a rapidly deepening cyclone pulling in very cold air, fast enough to transform wet, inconvenient conditions into dangerous winter conditions before dawn. Then the wind took over. A powerful storm with a very low central pressure creates a steep pressure gradient, which is meteorology's calm phrase for air being strongly urged to move from one place to another. The tighter that gradient becomes, the harder the wind tends to blow. Official summaries of the blizzard report wind gusts averaging 50 to 70 miles per hour for much of January 26th in Ohio, with 82 miles per hour recorded in Cleveland and even higher values reported over Lake Erie. The Cleveland office later noted that strong winds aloft, around 80 knots at about 5,000 feet, were able to transfer down to the surface because of the cold air moving in. That matters because surface wind is what turns snowfall into a true blizzard problem. Once loose snow and newly falling snow are being picked up and moved at that speed, visibility can collapse and drifts can build faster than people expect. This is where people sometimes misunderstand severe winter storms. They focus only on snowfall totals. Totals matter, of course, but in a storm like this, the wind can be more destructive than the measured snowfall amount suggests. Cleveland snowfall from the main storm was significant, But the city's famous suffering during the blizzard was not explained by raw snow depth alone. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes about 8 inches of snow in the city, but it also notes sustained winds around 53 miles per hour, gusts to 82 miles per hour, and a temperature drop of 39 degrees in 6 hours. That combination is what makes roads disappear under drifting, what turns open spaces into white sheets of moving snow, and what makes an already snow-covered region suddenly unmanageable. Strong wind is how a winter storm stops being a ploughing problem and becomes a visibility and survival problem. Another reason the storm became so formidable is that there was already snow on the ground in much of the broader region. The Cleveland National Weather Service summary explains that the heavy snow and the blowing of deep snow already on the ground combined with the incoming cold front and severe wind to create full blizzard conditions all across Ohio. That detail matters because even if falling snow had instantly stopped, the wind would still have had plenty to work with. Existing snow cover acts like inventory for the storm. It can be stripped from fields, medians, shoulders, rooftops and open lots, and then redeposited in roads, around vehicles, against buildings, and across anything that interrupts the airflow. In practical terms, the storm did not have to create every obstacle from scratch. Part of the state had already supplied raw material. At this point, it helps to step back and notice how many moving parts had to line up. A southern low carrying moisture, a northern Arctic setup carrying severe cold, distinct upper-level waves that merged in a favourable way, strong jet streaks phasing overhead, a surface low that deepened explosively while racing north, an Arctic front arriving at just the right moment to turn rain and fog into blinding snow and drifting, strong winds aloft mixing down to the surface, existing snow cover ready to be picked up and blown into drifts. None of those factors by itself would guarantee a historic Cleveland disaster. Together they produced one. That is why the event still stands out in weather history. It was not just powerful, it was mechanically efficient in the worst possible way. There is also something worth saying about forecasting, because it would be easy to imagine that a storm this dramatic must have appeared from nowhere. That is not really true. Weather offices had issued blizzard warnings by late on January 25th, and the Detroit office later wrote that forecasters did an admirable job given the primitive model guidance available at the time. But forecast skill and public experience are not the same thing. A warning can be issued, understood by professionals, even taken seriously by many people, and the lived shock of the event can still be enormous once the atmosphere starts moving faster than daily routine can adapt. You can know a severe winter storm is coming and still be stunned by the rate at which the pressure falls, the temperature collapses, and the wind turns visibility into guesswork. Forecasting tells you what is likely. Experience tells you what it actually feels like when the front arrives. That is why the scientific explanation of this blizzard matters so much to the story. It is not an ornamental layer added afterward. It is the reason the event unfolded the way it did. People in Cleveland were not dealing with a large ordinary snowstorm. They were dealing with a rapidly deepening Great Lakes cyclone that had found every advantage the atmosphere could give it. The low pressure became exceptionally deep. The pressure gradient became violent. The Arctic air arrived fast. The rain-to-snow changeover happened during the hours when people were least prepared to reassess. The winds became strong enough to erase the practical usefulness of snow totals and focus attention instead on whiteout, drifting, exposure, and immobilization. The city was not simply snowed on. It was overtaken by a storm that had grown at unusual speed into a full regional machine for disruption. And once that kind of machine is fully assembled, the shift from routine weather to a citywide emergency can happen faster than memory expects. One evening, there is rain, fog, and cautious talk. A few hours later, the pressure has crashed. The cold front has cut through, the wind is driving snow sideways, and the same roads people intended to use for work and school are starting to vanish under moving white. That is the real meaning of the storm becoming a weather bomb. It is not just that the barometer falls impressively. It is that the atmosphere reaches a point where ordinary plans stop being relevant. Cleveland was about to find that out before the morning had properly started, when the overnight strengthening of the storm translated into the thing that people remember most clearly afterward: the sudden realization that the sky had changed the rules while everyone was asleep. There is something especially unnerving about weather that changes while most people are asleep. A storm in the middle of the afternoon at least gives you the courtesy of introducing itself. You can see the sky shift. You can hear the rain begin. You can decide in real time whether this is still a normal day or whether the day has been taken over by something larger. An overnight storm does not bother with that kind of politeness. It works behind the walls and windows while people are making coffee plans for the morning, setting alarms, putting out clothes for work, and assuming that whatever comes next will still fit within the shape of an ordinary winter day. In Ohio, on the night of January 25th into the morning of January 26th, 1978, that assumption was dismantled with remarkable speed. National Weather Service summaries describe rain and fog during the evening, followed by a violent arrival of Arctic air, rapidly falling temperatures, explosive strengthening of the low, and spreading blizzard conditions before or around dawn across the state, reaching Cleveland by about 7 a.m. That sequence matters because it helps explain why the morning felt so shocking. If the night had already been snowy and bitterly cold, people would have gone to bed with a clearer sense of what kind of morning to expect. But in many places, the evening did not look like the opening of one of the most notorious blizzards in Ohio history. It looked wet. It looked murky. It looked like one of those disagreeable winter nights when the roads might be slick later and the forecast may have to be taken more seriously than usual, but not necessarily like the prelude to a citywide collapse of movement. The official Cleveland and Wilmington National Weather Service histories both note that rain and fog were part of the setup before the cold front arrived, and that the real blizzard conditions spread in the early morning hours as temperatures plunged and winds surged. So picture Cleveland late that night, streetlights reflected in wet pavement, car tyres throwing up a little spray, visibility already dulled by fog in some places, the kind of January discomfort that seems more irritating than historic. A person heading home late might have muttered that the weather was ugly. Someone else might have listened to the forecast and thought the commute would be rough. None of that would have been unreasonable. The danger with fast-changing winter systems is not that people are foolish. It is that the atmosphere can revise its intentions between bedtime and breakfast. By the time the city began waking up on January 26th, the storm had intensified drastically. The pressure had plunged to a record low in Cleveland, and the air over northeast Ohio was in the process of becoming something far harsher than it had looked only a few hours earlier. The Cleveland barometer fell to about 28.28 inches, the lowest pressure ever recorded in Ohio, while the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes that the storm's eye reached the city around 4 to 5 a.m. That detail about the timing is worth sitting with for a moment. Around 4 or 5 in the morning is exactly when a city is at its most vulnerable to surprise. Night shift workers are tired. Early commuters are only just beginning to stir. Road crews are active. But the larger public is not yet fully awake and responsive. Families are not gathered around radios making decisions together. Most people are still inside sleep's soft confusion, the part of the night when judgment is slow and habit is strong. If the weather changes dramatically at that hour, then millions of small choices made the night before are suddenly exposed as outdated, before the people who made them have even rubbed their eyes properly. And the weather did change dramatically. As the Arctic front pushed through the Cleveland area, the temperature dropped with astonishing speed. The Detroit National Weather Service office reports that Cleveland fell from 44 degrees at 4 a.m. to 7 degrees by 10 a.m. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History gives the same collapse a slightly broader frame, stating that the temperature dropped 39 degrees in 6 hours. The Cleveland National Weather Service summary describes temperatures falling 30 degrees in 2 hours as the cold front arrived, and the blizzard became unmistakable. All of those descriptions point to the same reality. This was not a gentle overnight cooling. It was a rapid atmospheric shove from one seasonally unpleasant state into another that was plainly dangerous. You can imagine what that meant at ground level. Wet surfaces beginning to harden, slush turning treacherous, rain changing over while the air itself seemed to tighten. The kind of cold that enters a city not as background but as an active force, changing how roads behave, how engines respond, how long exposed skin can tolerate the wind, and how fast a bad situation becomes worse. Meteorological summaries make this sound clinical, but in a lived sense it means the city was losing margin. Everything that had seemed merely inconvenient a little earlier was now becoming brittle, faster, and less forgiving. Then came the wind, and with it the moment when a bad winter morning stopped being interpretable as just another hard Great Lakes day. The National Weather Service summary from Wilmington states that wind gusts averaged 50 to 70 miles per hour through much of January 26th, reaching 82 miles per hour in Cleveland. The Cleveland office notes winds increased to more than 50 miles an hour as the front arrived, and the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History Records sustained winds of 53 miles per hour, with gusts to 82. At those speeds, the storm stopped behaving like a simple snow event and began behaving like a machine for stripping visibility, moving snow into drifts and making every exposed road and vehicle far less reliable than they had been even a short time before. This is the point where the phrase collapse of the sky starts to make practical sense, because people do not experience a blizzard as a neat list of variables. They experience it as a loss of clarity above and ahead. The horizon disappears first, then distance becomes suspicious, then the street itself starts to look less like a route and more like a white argument with no edges. Official summaries say visibilities were near zero for much of January 26th, and in some places even into the next day. In other words, once the transformation was complete, it did not simply pass through in an hour and move on. It settled in and held its grip. You could not talk yourself out of it by saying the next block would look better. The next block was often not visible enough to promise anything. For people waking early for work, that change must have felt almost insulting in its speed. One moment the world is a known place with weather attached to it. The next, the weather has taken possession of the place. That is the difference between a winter day and a true blizzard emergency. In a normal winter morning, the city is still in charge. Roads may be slick, schedules may be delayed, and tempers may be poor, but the basic structure holds. In a morning like January 26, 1978, the structure stopped holding before many people had even left home. Weather historians note that transportation, business, industry, and schools across Ohio were brought to a standstill for several days, and the Ohio Turnpike itself was forced to close. Those later consequences began in these early hours, when the city first discovered that motion was becoming harder than routine had planned for. There is also a sensory side to severe winter weather that official reports only hint at. Wind at that strength is not just a number, it changes the sound of everything. Houses creak differently, loose objects stop sounding ordinary. The outside no longer seems merely cold but active, as though the air has acquired intention. Snow moving at that speed does not float down in a charming winter way. It cuts across fields and intersections, slams into sides of buildings, wraps around corners, and fills space so densely that seeing becomes work. When the Cleveland National Weather Service described blinding, wind-blown snow filling the air as the front arrived, that was not a flourish. It was literal enough to define the day. And because there was already deep snow on the ground in many parts of Ohio, the storm had material to work with. The Cleveland office specifically notes that the blizzard conditions were produced not only by falling snow, but by heavy blowing of deep snow already on the ground. That is one reason major blizzards can seem to intensify beyond what a snowfall total alone would suggest. A storm like this does not need to manufacture all its trouble fresh from the clouds. It can pick up what the landscape has already stored and redistribute it, with great enthusiasm and very bad timing. Fields, shoulders, medians, side roads, and open areas all become supply lines for drifts. A road that might have remained passable under moderate snowfall becomes something else entirely when strong winds are constantly refilling it with snow stripped from somewhere nearby. So, before sunrise had fully given way to morning, Cleveland was dealing with several overlapping shocks at once. The pressure had fallen to a record level. The temperature had plunged. The wind had increased into a range that people in any city would respect, but that became especially destructive in a snow-covered region. Visibility had collapsed. The weather had changed from wet and foggy to bitterly cold and nearly impossible to see through. And all of this had happened during the most disorienting part of the day, when the public is trying to convert sleep into decision-making. That combination is why the event felt less like a storm gradually worsening and more like a hard reset of reality. You can imagine households discovering the situation in stages. One person gets up first and looks out. Another asks what it is doing outside. The answer is probably not very precise at first, because blizzard conditions resist tidy description. You do not say, "It is snowing." You say something more like, "It is bad." Radios go on, curtains are opened farther. Someone tries the back door and finds the wind pushing against it. Someone else wonders whether work will still expect them in. Someone makes a call and finds the line busy or the information incomplete because the whole region is waking into the same problem at once. Severe weather is often remembered through these domestic moments of recognition, because that is when the event becomes real. Not when the low passes some pressure threshold. Not when a forecaster writes a warning. When the kitchen window tells the truth, and the truth that morning was that Cleveland had crossed from weather into consequence. A routine city wakes by layers. Newspaper deliveries, factory shifts, hospital rounds, school buses, delivery routes, offices, shops. When the weather becomes severe enough before those layers are fully in motion, it can trap the day before it has properly started. That is what happened here. The famous stranded vehicles, the immobilized roads, the enormous drifts and the citywide paralysis did not emerge from nowhere at noon. They were born in these early morning hours when the atmosphere moved faster than ordinary systems could respond. By the time many people would normally have been leaving for work, blizzard conditions had already spread all the way to Cleveland, and visibilities were near zero. There is a reason old blizzards stay alive in local memory long after exact wind speeds have been forgotten. People remember the morning feeling. They remember looking outside and not recognizing the practical meaning of their own street. They remember the first realization that familiar rules had been suspended. They remember that the weather had not merely become unpleasant, it had become authoritative. On January 26, 1978, Cleveland discovered this between darkness and daylight. The city did not ease into catastrophe. It woke into it. And because the storm's centre reached the area before dawn, there is also that strange, almost theatrical fact of timing. The city's most dramatic transformation occurred while the sky itself was still deciding whether it was night or morning. That half-light matters in memory. Winter dawn is already pale and uncertain. Add fog from earlier hours, then wind-blown snow, then plunging cold, and the world takes on a flattened, hostile look even before the full day is visible. Distances become unreliable. Motion feels exposed. A person stepping outside for the first time may not even have had the comfort of clear daylight to help judge the danger properly. They simply met noise, cold, and whiteness all at once. It is tempting in retrospect to tell a story like this as though everyone instantly understood the scale of what had happened. In reality, recognition probably spread unevenly. Some people would have known right away that the day was impossible. Others would have tried to go anyway because obligation has a strong voice in the morning, especially in working cities. Some would have been caught already driving when conditions finished collapsing. That is how the blizzard's next phase begins, and it is one of the hardest parts of the story. Once people start moving into a weather emergency that has overtaken the road network faster than expected, the storm stops being only a sky event and becomes a human one, measured in stalled cars, blocked highways, stranded workers, and a city finding out just how little visibility, traction, and confidence were left once daylight had fully arrived. By the time morning properly arrived in Cleveland, the city was no longer dealing with weather in the ordinary sense. The weather had already taken hold of the streets, the highways, the intersections, the parking lots, and the spaces between buildings. It had changed the meaning of distance. It had changed the meaning of leaving the house. It had changed the meaning of a familiar road. The overnight collapse had done its work before most people were fully awake, and now the city had to face what that meant in daylight, or at least in the pale, blurred version of daylight that a major blizzard allows. What people met that morning was not just snow, it was a whiteout world. That distinction matters. Snow is something you can usually understand while you're standing in it. You know where the road is, you know where the sidewalk ends, you know roughly how far away the next car or house or signpost might be. A whiteout takes those ordinary certainties and strips them away. The National Weather Service summary for the Ohio blizzard says visibilities were near zero through much of January 26th, and in some places continued into January 27th. In practical terms, that means a person could step outside in a place they knew well and still not be able to trust what they were seeing. The city was there, but it was blurred, flattened, and partially erased by blowing snow and wind. That must have been one of the first real shocks of the morning, the visual shock. A person wakes, checks the window, and instead of finding a bad winter morning, finds a view that is barely useful. The house across the street may be vague. The parked cars may look less like vehicles and more like lumps collecting snow. The line between curb and roadway may already be difficult to judge. In stronger gusts, even near objects may fade in and out behind sheets of moving white. The wind does not let the scene settle. It keeps reworking it. That is one of the cruel things about blizzard conditions. They do not simply cover the landscape and leave it there for inspection. They keep the landscape in motion, which means the eye never gets a calm picture to work with, and Cleveland on January 26, 1978, had more than enough wind to make that happen. Official storm summaries note sustained winds around 50 miles per hour and gusts to 82 miles per hour in Cleveland, with strong winds persisting through much of the day. Those numbers matter because wind is what transforms winter from an inconvenience into a visibility crisis. Snowfall alone can make travel difficult. Snow plus violent wind can make orientation itself unreliable. A road that might still be passable under steady snowfall becomes nearly useless when the air keeps lifting snow from the ground and throwing it back across the surface. A driver no longer deals only with what is falling from the sky. The driver also deals with what the ground is sending back upward. That is why the morning did not unfold like a simple snow day. A snow day suggests stillness. This was not still. This was moving, scraping, gusting, and rebuilding itself by the minute. Snow that had already fallen earlier in the season was dragged into the storm's work, and the Cleveland National Weather Service office specifically notes that deep snow already on the ground was blown around by the severe wind as the blizzard developed. So the city was not just receiving snow, it was being rearranged by it. One yard might be scoured thin while a driveway a few yards away collected a deep drift. One side of a street might look partly exposed while the other side was beginning to vanish under blown snow. In a normal winter storm, plows chase accumulation. In a storm like this, plows also have to chase relocation. Now think about what that means at the household level. Somewhere in Cleveland, people were making the first practical decisions of the day. Should anyone try to leave? Is work still possible? Are schools open? Can the car even be reached properly? Is the front door blocked by drifting? Is the back entrance better? Can anyone tell what is happening on the main road from the house? Or does the house itself sit inside too much moving snow to judge it? A storm becomes personal very quickly when it turns simple morning questions into uncertain ones. Winter cities are used to asking, how bad is it out there? This was the kind of morning that made the answer difficult because ordinary language starts failing. Bad compared to what? Compared to a rough commute? Compared to a storm last year? Compared to the kind of weather that keeps the children home? None of those comparisons feel adequate when the view out the window is already half gone. This is also where routine becomes a liability. On normal mornings, obligation pushes people outward. Work begins at a set time. Deliveries are expected. Shifts must be covered. Appointments were scheduled before the sky made other plans. The problem is that routine gives people momentum just when the environment is asking them to stop. That helps explain why so many severe weather disasters become transportation disasters first. It is not because everyone suddenly loses common sense. It is because daily life has already wound itself up to move, and many people do not discover how impossible that movement has become until they are already trying. By the time the blizzard reached full force in Cleveland, transportation across the state was shutting down, and the Ohio Turnpike had to close because of conditions. So imagine those first attempts to move through the city. Someone clears the windshield only to watch it fill again before they finish. Someone starts down a side street and realizes the difference between street and shoulder is no longer obvious. Someone reaches a main road expecting it to be better maintained and instead finds a broader strip of wind-blown uncertainty. At intersections, traffic lights may still function, but the notion that they are controlling orderly movement becomes a little absurd once drivers can barely see past the next few car lengths, or less. This is one of the strangest features of a whiteout morning in a built environment. The structure of the city is still technically there. Signals, lanes, medians, signs, and exits all remain in place, but the weather has cut the lines connecting them. The system survives physically while losing much of its practical meaning. Cleveland was not a city unused to winter driving, which makes this point even sharper. People there knew how to handle snow better than many places would have. They knew to slow down, to leave room, to respect ice and drifting. But no amount of local experience can fully cancel out near zero visibility combined with high winds, rapidly falling temperatures, and roads that are being filled in faster than confidence can keep up. Severe blizzards do not just test skill. They test whether the environment still allows skill to matter. In whiteout conditions, even a cautious driver can become trapped by a pileup, a drift, a stalled truck, or the simple fact that the road ahead has ceased to be legible. And outside the cars, the city was changing shape as people watched. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes that although snowfall in Cleveland measured about 8 inches from the main storm, drifts reached far greater depths because of the wind, and that distinction helps explain the day better than total snowfall ever could. 8 inches is substantial, but it does not by itself explain why the city entered memory the way it did. Drifting does. Drifting is what buries cars higher on one side than the other. Drifting is what fills alleys, blocks doorways, and turns familiar corners into uneven white barriers. Drifting is what takes a flat snowfall and sculpts it into obstacles. When people later remembered the blizzard, they were often remembering what wind had done to snow, not just what snow had done to the city. There is another practical problem that arrives with a whiteout morning, and that is scale. A city can look manageable from inside one neighbourhood, while the larger road network is already failing. Someone standing at a front window may decide the conditions are difficult, but perhaps possible. What they cannot see is the blocked interchange miles away, the stranded buses, the truck jackknifed in drifting snow, the freeway lane that has become a line of stopped vehicles, or the plough route that is itself falling behind because visibility is too poor, and wind keeps undoing the work. Severe storms often outrun the local view. People decide using the few hundred feet they can judge from home, while the wider system has already tipped into crisis beyond that distance. The morning radio must have become essential very quickly. In storms like this, the voice coming through the speaker takes on unusual authority because outside evidence is incomplete. People want reports from elsewhere. They want closures, warnings, descriptions from the highways, mention of whether schools are calling off, whether offices are shutting, whether authorities are saying to stay home. But information on severe weather mornings can lag reality by just enough to be dangerous. Conditions can deteriorate faster than announcements can circulate. What is technically open at 6 o'clock may be unreachable by 7. What seems plausible from one suburb may be absurd downtown or along the lakefront. The city wakes unevenly, and the storm uses that unevenness. Meanwhile, the physical cold was becoming more serious by the hour. Official summaries describe a dramatic temperature crash in Cleveland, from the mid-40s before dawn to near 7 degrees by around 10 a.m., with wind chills plunging far below zero. That kind of drop changes how people experience even short exposure. A storm that begins as a travel problem can quickly become an exposure problem once stalled cars, blocked roads, or lost footing keep people outside longer than planned. In a whiteout world, mistakes lengthen themselves. Walking from a parked car to a building may take longer because the path is drifted over. Reaching a stranded person may take longer because the route is unclear. A decision to just go back may become harder than expected because the thing you're trying to go back toward is barely visible now. There is also the matter of confidence wearing away in real time. Early in the morning, some people probably still believed they could beat the worst of it, get through before the roads became impossible, or stick to main routes and manage. Then the reality of the whiteout morning would have corrected that thought. Not all at once, perhaps. Sometimes it only takes one gust sweeping across a road to show a driver that visibility is not poor but absent. Sometimes it takes reaching a highway entrance and seeing it clogged. Sometimes it takes looking at a drift crossing a lane and realizing the road is no longer a road in the usual sense. Severe weather often changes minds, not by argument, but by demonstration. What makes whiteout conditions so frightening is not simply the inability to see far, it is the inability to trust what little you can see. A darker patch ahead may be pavement, or it may be shadow, or it may be the edge of a drift. The faint shape on the right may be a car, or it may be a mound of snow against a guardrail. In a city environment where people depend on quick reading of signs, lights, lanes, and surrounding vehicles, that uncertainty spreads fast. Driving becomes mentally exhausting because every second requires interpretation, and the scene keeps changing before interpretation is finished. This would have affected pedestrians as well. Walking in a blizzard is often described too casually by people who have not done it in serious conditions. They imagine cold and blowing snow, which is true, but they often miss the strain of simply keeping direction. Wind-driven snow hits the face. Breathing becomes deliberate. Eyes water. Glasses become useless. Footing varies from scraped pavement to hidden drifts to patches of ice created by the overnight transition from rain and slush to sudden cold. In a whiteout morning, even short distances become awkward and tiring, and that matters in a city where many people still have to try to get from door to car, bus stop to workplace, or parking lot to entrance. For emergency services and public works, this was the hour when the ordinary logic of response started breaking down. The city depends on police, fire, ambulances, and plough crews remaining mobile when others are told not to be. But a whiteout world makes that privilege of movement fragile. The Cleveland office's historical summaries make clear that the state and region experienced widespread paralysis in transportation. That does not happen unless the people meant to keep systems moving are themselves fighting the same wind, the same drifts, the same near-zero visibility, and the same rapidly worsening road conditions as everyone else. A plough is more capable than a family sedan, obviously, but even a plough becomes limited if drifts keep reforming and visibility keeps vanishing. The storm does not politely spare the people sent to contain it, and so the city spent that morning learning a difficult lesson in stages. The first stage was visual. The world looked wrong. The second stage was practical. Moving through it was harder than expected. The third stage was structural. The larger network of roads, workplaces and public systems was not merely delayed, but beginning to fail under the strain. Once a city reaches that third stage, the mood changes. People stop asking whether the weather is bad and start asking what is still functioning at all. By late morning, many of the ordinary markers of civic rhythm had been interrupted or erased. School was not a question of tardiness but closure. Work became not a matter of commuting effort, but of whether commuting had become irresponsible or impossible. Shopping, errands, appointments, And all the small motion that usually fills a weekday had given way to more basic concerns. Who is stranded? Who made it back? Whether heat is steady? Whether elderly relatives are all right? Whether anyone is trying to travel who should not be? Storms do not just shut roads, they simplify priorities very quickly. That simplification is one reason people remember whiteout mornings with such clarity even decades later. The city is reduced to essentials: shelter, heat, visibility, communication, help. Everything that usually feels important is pushed behind those things. Cleveland on the morning of January 26, 1978, was still itself in name, but in practical terms it had become a different kind of place for a while. The normal city was hidden behind moving snow and stopped traffic. The whiteout city had taken its place, and once that happens, the next problem comes into view very fast. A whiteout world is dangerous enough from inside a house, or while deciding not to leave. It becomes much more serious once people are already out in it, on roads that are disappearing, in vehicles that are slowing to a stop, in a city whose morning routine has already been knocked off its tracks before noon, which is exactly where the story goes next, because the blizzard's most lasting damage to daily life came not only from what people saw when they looked outside, but from what happened when cars, freeways, and an entire moving city ran into weather that had decided it was no longer willing to share the road. A storm can look dangerous on paper for several different reasons. The snowfall may be heavy, the pressure may be falling fast, the temperatures may be crashing. But there comes a point in some winter disasters when one element stops being part of the story and becomes the thing driving almost everything else. In Cleveland on January 26, 1978, that element was the wind. The snow mattered, certainly. The cold mattered. The rapid deepening of the storm mattered. Yet what turned a severe winter event into a city-stopping emergency was the force with which air moved across the landscape once the blizzard was fully in place. Official National Weather Service summaries note wind gusts averaging 50 to 70 miles per hour across much of Ohio on January 26th, reaching 82 miles per hour in Cleveland, while the Cleveland Encyclopedia entry record sustained winds of 53 miles per hour with gusts to 82. Those are not rough winter day numbers. Those are the kind of numbers that take every existing problem and make it more active, more mobile, and much harder to control. That is the crucial distinction. Snow on its own accumulates. Wind weaponizes accumulation. Snow lies where it falls until traffic, plows, melting, or gravity rearrange it. Wind lifts it, strips it from one place, piles it in another, and keeps doing so faster than people can think of the storm as static. A road with 8 inches of snow is difficult. A road with 8 inches of snow plus near hurricane force gusts can disappear altogether because the storm is no longer just placing material on the road. It is continuously moving that material across the road. The National Weather Service Cleveland office specifically notes that the blizzard's severity came not only from falling snow, but also from heavy blowing of deep snow already on the ground, which means the wind had plenty to work with before any new flakes even entered the conversation. This is why snowfall totals, while important, do not fully explain why the blizzard of 1978 hit Cleveland the way it did. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes about 8 inches of snow in the city, which is substantial but not on its own, enough to explain why the event became legendary. What made it legendary was the combination of that snowfall with sustained 53-mile-per-hour winds, gusts to 82, a 39-degree temperature drop in 6 hours, and zero visibility at Hopkins Airport. Those numbers describe a storm that was not merely dropping snow onto Cleveland. It was actively remaking the surface of the city, while stripping away the ability to see what had been remade. That is a very different sort of disaster. It is the difference between digging out and losing the practical meaning of the street in the first place. People often imagine wind in winter as a matter of discomfort, the sort of thing that makes you regret a lighter coat and walk a little faster from the car to the door. In a storm like this, wind became infrastructure damage, transportation paralysis, exposure risk, and a visibility crisis all at once. The Cleveland Encyclopedia account states that 300 power lines were brought down by wind and branches, that 110,000 Greater Cleveland homes lost power, and that the illuminating company sent 140 crews to deal with the damage. That is the part of the blizzard that can get overlooked when the photographs of buried cars take centre stage. Wind was not only moving snow, it was also attacking systems people depended on for heat, communication, and ordinary winter survival. A cold storm with power intact is one thing. A cold storm that knocks out power to more than 100,000 homes is another matter entirely. It is worth pausing over that power loss detail because it changes the emotional shape of the storm. Once electricity becomes uncertain, winter weather stops being primarily an outdoor problem. It enters kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms, and apartment hallways. A person can stay off the roads and still be pulled into the emergency if the heat is out, the lights fail, or phones become harder to rely on. In a working city in January, that creates layers of difficulty. Families with small children, elderly residents, people depending on electric medical devices, and anyone in a poorly insulated building suddenly face a different category of decision-making. The storm is no longer just asking whether they can get somewhere. It is asking whether shelter itself will remain secure enough, and all the while the same winds making travel impossible are also slowing repair work, because utility crews have to move through the blizzard to fix what the blizzard has broken. Then there is the visibility problem, which wind made relentless. The National Weather Service summary for the 1978 blizzard states that visibilities were near zero for much of January 26th, and even into January 27th in some areas. That is not just a phrase for dramatic weather coverage. Near zero visibility means people cannot reliably distinguish lane from shoulder, moving car from drift, exit ramp from snowbank, or short walk from disorientation. Snowfall can reduce visibility, yes, but severe wind makes that reduction unstable. It blows loose snow from fields, medians, rooftops, and roads back into the air, which means even brief lulls do not necessarily restore clarity. The view closes and opens in pulses, often with the next gust arriving before the mind has finished trusting the last moment of partial sight. That is exhausting for drivers, dangerous for pedestrians, and miserable for anyone trying to operate heavy equipment. In practical terms, wind made every response slower. Snowplows can clear accumulated snow. They are much less effective when drifts are reforming immediately behind them, and when the driver cannot see far enough ahead to maintain a confident path. Emergency vehicles can respond through ordinary winter weather. They struggle when highways are clogged with stranded cars and whiteout conditions make route judgment uncertain. Utility crews can repair lines under cold conditions. They are delayed when the same winds that caused the outages continue roaring through the work area. The storm did not only create tasks, it sabotaged the completion of those tasks while they were underway. That is why the blizzard could shut down transportation, business, industry, and schools statewide for 2 days, with the normal pace of life not returning for about 5 days, according to the Cleveland National Weather Service office. The wind helped turn a one-day weather event into a multi-day systems failure. Another reason the wind became the central problem is that it erased the usefulness of local winter experience. Clevelanders knew snow, they knew cold, they knew the lake could make weather meaner than inland forecasts might suggest, but no amount of common-sense winter skill can fully compensate for sustained winds in the 50-mile-per-hour range with gusts above 80, while temperatures plunge and roads are being actively filled with drifting snow. That is the point where competence starts colliding with physics. People who normally handle snow just fine suddenly find that braking gently, steering carefully, and keeping a little extra distance do not solve the basic issue that the road itself is no longer reliably visible or consistently open. The weather is no longer asking for better winter habits. It is removing the space in which those habits can work. Wind also magnified the cold in ways that changed human endurance. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes wind chill values below -100 degrees Fahrenheit, using the formula then in use, which reflects just how extreme the combination of wind and temperature felt during the blizzard. Even leaving aside the old formula's dramatics, the meteorological reality was severe. Cleveland fell from around 44 degrees at 4 a.m. to about 7 degrees by 10 a.m., according to the Detroit National Weather Service office, while the Cleveland office described temperature drops of around 30 degrees in 2 hours as the cold front moved through. A person stranded in a car or forced to walk through the air was not simply cold. They were losing body heat in a hurry because the same wind-destroying visibility was also stripping warmth away from exposed skin and clothing. This is where the storm becomes deadly, in a particularly Midwestern way. Not through one dramatic wave or wall of flame, but through ordinary motion being interrupted in a hostile environment. A driver sets out assuming the trip will be ugly, then finds traffic stopped by drifting and whiteout. The car idles, fuel burns, the tailpipe risks being blocked by snow, and stepping outside becomes dangerous because the wind is fierce and orientation poor. Someone walking a short distance discovers that short has become a less useful word once the air itself is pushing back. A crew member trying to clear a route learns that the route is being rebuilt by the storm faster than the machinery can answer. Wind multiplies trouble by taking every delay and making it colder, every stop and making it riskier, every attempt to help and making it slower. It also changed the hierarchy of places. In a typical storm, major roads are safer bets than side streets because they are ploughed first and travelled more. In the blizzard of 1978, open highways and exposed roads could become some of the worst locations precisely because they gave the wind room to operate. Open stretches allow snow to blow across without interruption, building drifts and cutting visibility to almost nothing. That is one reason the Ohio Turnpike became such a symbol of the storm. The Ohio Memory Archive includes aerial images and historical discussion of truckers and travellers dealing with blizzard conditions on the turnpike, which matches the broader Weather Service accounts of statewide transportation collapse. Highways are built for movement, but in the wrong wind they become long channels of exposure with very little shelter, and too many vehicles committed to the route already. The force of the wind also changed what counted as a barrier. A few inches of drifted snow along a curb are irritating. Several feet of drift across a roadway can stop passenger vehicles cold. The National Weather Service Wilmington summary notes drifts exceeding 10 to 15 feet in parts of Ohio, while other regional summaries describe huge drifts formed by powerful winds and existing snow cover. Those numbers are not decorative. They explain why travel did not simply become slow. It became impossible in many places. The city can survive heavy snow if the snow mostly stays where it falls, and crews can attack it in an orderly way. A city struggles badly when the wind builds irregular walls across the transport network, because then the problem is not simply depth, but shape. Drifts form in the places people need to move through most, and they rarely form in a neat way that plows appreciate. There is also the psychological effect of such wind, which should not be underestimated. Strong winter wind is loud in a way that alters judgment. It howls around buildings, presses against doors, rattles windows, and gives the outside environment a kind of continuous agitation. A city can hear when it is losing control of conditions. That sound matters because it convinces even before the eyes fully do. Someone standing inside a house or apartment can know, from sound alone, that this is not an ordinary snow day. The storm is not drifting quietly down over the neighbourhood, it is shoving at it. That helps explain why memories of major blizzards are often as auditory as they are visual. People remember the roar around the house, the hiss of snow against windows, the strange way even familiar blocks sounded empty, because fewer engines were moving and the wind had become the main voice outdoors. The sustained and gusting winds documented by weather offices gave the storm that acoustic presence all day. Once wind reaches that degree of dominance, even official authority begins speaking a different language. The Cleveland Encyclopedia account notes that Governor James Rhodes declared a statewide emergency and activated the National Guard, while the same source mentions that Cleveland Mayor Dennis Kucinich was prevented from returning from Washington, leaving Finance Director Joseph DeGreen to establish a command post as acting mayor. Those are unusually vivid civic details, and they underline the point that wind-driven blizzard conditions had pushed the problem beyond normal municipal inconvenience. When weather stops politicians from physically returning to the city and requires a command post plus guard activation, that is no longer a matter of roads are rough. It is a recognition that ordinary local capacity is being outpaced, and still the wind kept complicating everything. Airports depend on visibility, runway treatment and predictable operations. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes that Hopkins Airport closed early with zero visibility. Again, the snowfall total alone does not tell that story. Airports are built to handle winter. They are not built to pretend zero visibility, and extreme drifting are merely inconvenient. Rail movement, trucking, and local deliveries all face similar limits. At some point, the issue is not whether workers are willing. It is whether the weather has made safe operation too uncertain to continue. By morning, that point had plainly been reached in much of the region. Transportation and commerce were not simply delayed. They were forcibly reduced by the combination of wind, cold, and whiteout. There is an uncomfortable lesson in that. We tend to think of wind as secondary in winter, as a modifier attached to the main weather of snow or cold. Add wind, chance of blowing snow, wind chill, gusty at times. The blizzard of 1978 shows how misleading that can be. In the worst winter events, wind is not a modifier. It is the engine that converts a heavy storm into a paralysing one. It takes whatever snow exists and redistributes it into drifts. It takes whatever cold exists and makes human exposure more urgent. It takes whatever visibility remains and removes it. It takes whatever infrastructure is exposed and tests it until lines fail, crews slow, and travel stops. The storm's meteorology may have been defined by explosive deepening and the plunge of central pressure, but the lived disaster in Cleveland was, to a remarkable degree, delivered by moving air. That is why so many later descriptions of the blizzard sound less interested in the beauty of snowfall than in the violence of motion. People remember cars swallowed by drifts, roads erased, power lines down, and the sense that stepping outside meant entering an active hazard rather than merely cold weather. The difference is subtle in language and enormous in practice. A snowy city is still a city. A wind-driven whiteout turns the city into an obstacle course where streets are provisional, landmarks are blurred, and every exposed task takes longer than planned. Cleveland woke to that reality, and through the day the wind enforced it with a kind of blunt persistence. By then, of course, the next layer of trouble was already underway. Once wind has closed the view, filled the roads, and started knocking out power, people do not remain neatly indoors. Some are already driving, some are trying to get home, some are stuck on freeways, some are caught in vehicles they assumed would get them through the morning. That is where the storm's most human scenes begin to gather, because after the wind became the real disaster, it did not stay in the sky. It moved directly into the daily machinery of cars, highways, and a city that suddenly found itself unable to keep moving at all. By the time Cleveland's storm had fully turned the morning white, the next problem was already larger than weather alone. A blizzard becomes truly serious when it stops being something people look at and starts being something people are trapped inside while trying to move. On January 26, 1978, that happened on roads, ramps, city streets, and freeways across Ohio with remarkable speed. Official National Weather Service summaries say transportation, schools, and businesses were shut down for days, that enormous drifts brought air, rail, and highway transportation to a complete standstill for 24 hours or more, and that cars were easily buried with many people stranded inside them. In Ohio, the entire length of the turnpike closed for the first time in its history. Interstate 75 was closed for 3 days, and some roads in many parts of the state were still not passable until Monday, January 30th. That is the point when a storm stops being measured mainly in inches and starts being measured in halted motion. A city can survive deep snow if the roads remain roads. It can survive bitter cold if people can still get where they need to go. It can survive wind if essential routes stay usable. But once cars stop, once highways fill, once drifts begin to bury vehicles faster than crews can clear them, the storm has found the weak point in ordinary urban life. Modern cities depend on movement so completely that stillness feels unnatural almost at once. Deliveries stop. Staff cannot reach hospitals. Workers cannot get home. Fire trucks need clearing before they can even leave their stations. The machine of the city has not been broken in one dramatic snap. It has simply been choked from 1,000 directions at once. That is why the Ohio Memory History of the Blizzard quotes the state's after-action report describing the immobilization effect as comparable to a statewide nuclear attack, at least from the standpoint of transportation and movement. Cleveland, like any serious winter city, would have expected difficulty. It would not have expected useless roads. That is an important distinction. People there were used to leaving earlier, driving more carefully, accepting delays, and treating January as a practical opponent rather than a surprise. What they woke into on January 26th was not just difficult driving, it was the collapse of the normal bargain between car and road. A road is supposed to give shape to travel. Even in bad weather, it usually still tells you where to go, how wide the lane is, whether you're approaching a curve, shoulder, exit, or median. In a true blizzard with sustained strong winds and near zero visibility, those instructions begin to disappear. Official storm summaries note near zero visibility for much of January 26th, gusts to 82 miles per hour in Cleveland, and drifts reaching 15 to 25 feet in parts of the region. Under those conditions, a freeway can remain physically present while losing its practical identity. That is what makes freeway paralysis so unnerving. Roads are built to move large numbers of people quickly and with confidence, but freeways also have a weakness. Once enough vehicles are committed to them, and weather turns against visibility, they become very hard to unwind. A neighbourhood street allows for retreat. A driveway, a side road, or even a cautious turnaround may still exist in some form. A freeway offers fewer choices. Cars move in one broad exposed stream, and when that stream slows because of drifting snow, stalled vehicles, or the simple fact that no one can see safely ahead, it can lock into place. Then the danger changes shape. A moving car is a transportation tool. A stopped car in a blizzard becomes a shelter, a hazard, a trap, and a decision point all at once. It is easy now to imagine that everyone would simply have stayed home. Real mornings do not work that way. Work shifts still existed. Deliveries were still expected. People had children to drop off, offices to reach, hospitals to staff, factories to open, and routes they had driven in bad weather before. The problem with a storm like this is not that people ignored winter. The problem is that ordinary life had already been wound up before the worst of the blizzard fully announced itself. Some people would have started out before understanding how quickly the road network was failing. Others would have known it looked terrible but assumed the main roads would be better. That's a very human assumption, and in most storms it is partly true. In a storm driven by violent wind and drifting snow, the main roads can become some of the worst places to be because they are open, exposed, and full of other people making the same calculation. Once enough cars are out there, the storm gains an ally: congestion. Not traffic in the ordinary impatient sense, but the kind that turns weather into a chain reaction. One vehicle slows sharply. Another hesitates because visibility vanishes. A truck struggles on a drift or loses traction. A lane begins to fill with uncertain cars. Someone stops because they cannot see. Someone else stops because the first person has stopped. Within minutes, a road designed for steady flow becomes a line of stationary metal boxes in a white field. In a blizzard, that is not just inconvenient. It is dangerous because vehicles that are standing still are still exposed to wind, drifting, cold, and the possibility of being buried deeper the longer they remain in place. The National Weather Service review says many individuals were left stranded in their vehicles and that snowdrifts in northern Ohio were tall enough to bury whole semis. That detail is easy to read quickly and miss. Whole semis. Once a storm is capable of burying equipment built for freight and highway travel, passenger cars are no longer serious contestants in the argument. They are objects waiting to be shaped by the drift pattern around them. The person inside may still think in terms of restarting, reversing, or inching forward. The blizzard is thinking in terms of accumulation, visibility, and whether that vehicle will still resemble a vehicle by the end of the day. There is also the deeply ordinary tragedy of abandoned cars. A major blizzard produces them because there comes a point when drivers stop asking how to continue and start asking whether they should stay with the vehicle at all. Cleveland Magazine's retrospective, drawing on local accounts and city records, says hundreds of motorists abandoned their cars along Cleveland's roads, and that city crews later towed nearly 1,000 unclaimed autos to 8 parking lots. That image says a great deal about the scale of paralysis. Nearly 1,000 unclaimed cars do not appear because of one sloppy commute. They appear because an entire city lost the ability to move through itself normally, and because ordinary drivers reached the point where leaving the car behind felt safer or more realistic than staying with it. Even after the storm, those abandoned cars continued to shape the city's problem. Plows cannot clear streets efficiently if buried vehicles are hidden under drifts. Cleveland Magazine's account notes that street-parked and abandoned cars were buried under mounds of snow and blocked cleanup, forcing city crews to dig them out and tow them one by one. That is one of the lesser-noticed ways a blizzard extends its own lifespan. The storm ends, but its trapped objects remain. Adrift over open pavement is one thing. Adrift hiding a parked sedan is another. Crews have to proceed more cautiously, roads reopen more slowly, and the city spends days not just clearing snow, but disentangling its transportation system from the places where it froze in place. Freeways were the most dramatic symbol of this, but the stillness spread far beyond them. Streets clogged. Parking lots became storage for buried vehicles. Airport operations halted. Official summaries say Cleveland Hopkins Airport closed, and that all means of air, rail, and highway transportation were brought to a standstill for at least 24 hours in many places. Some highways and airports reopened later Friday or Saturday, but many roads were still not passable until Monday, and state roads remained closed in half of Ohio's counties on Saturday. In a modern state, that is a staggering level of interruption. It means not just travel is difficult, but movement as a system has partially ceased. The Ohio Turnpike closure deserves special attention because it captured the scale of the event in one stark fact. For the first time in its history, the entire length of the turnpike shut down because of the blizzard. Ohio Memory and the National Weather Service both make that point directly, and it matters because turnpikes are built for continuity. They are the kind of roads that are supposed to stay functional, especially with resources and priority behind them. Closing one end is serious. Closing the full length for the first time ever tells you that the storm had moved beyond normal engineering confidence. It had reached a stage where the state no longer considered its premier highway system reliably usable. And then there is the human improvisation that follows such closure. People shelter where they can. They walk if they must. They search for a building, a station, a truck stop, a way station, any place with walls and less wind. The National Weather Service Cleveland office recounts that motorists stranded on Interstate 75 near Findlay broke into a truckway station for shelter. That image is stark and practical, not looting, not panic in the theatrical sense, just the very fast realization that official shelter is farther away than the blizzard allows, and that a locked building has become a survival resource. This is how a transportation emergency becomes a human emergency. The road is no longer merely impassable, it has become a place people need to be rescued from. That is also why the Ohio National Guard became so important. Ohio Memory reports that more than 5,000 Guard members were called to duty, and that helicopters flew 2,700 missions across Ohio, rescuing stranded residents and motorists, moving doctors and nurses and getting food and medicine to places where the road system could not be trusted. Thousands of civilian volunteers with snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles also answered the call. Those details tell you something basic about the scale of the failure on the roads. The usual methods of civic movement were insufficient. When ordinary transportation is broken badly enough, the state starts borrowing mobility from military vehicles, helicopters, snowmobiles, and volunteers with whatever machinery can still force itself through. In Cleveland itself, local government was forced into a similar improvisational mode. Cleveland Magazine recounts that Finance Director Joseph DeGreen, acting in effect as the city's emergency leader, while Mayor Dennis Kucinich was stranded in Washington, worked from a command post in City Hall. The account also describes the frustration of ploughing during the storm itself as futile, because the wind kept undoing the work. That word matters. Futile. A city usually assumes that if it deploys enough effort, enough salt, enough trucks, enough coordination, it will slowly bend a storm back into manageable form. A blizzard like this can temporarily make that belief untrue. It is not that the crews are absent or unwilling. It is that the road is being rebuilt by the storm faster than the crews can win. That futility must have changed the mood of the city quite quickly. Early in the day, some people may still have been waiting for the roads to improve. By midday, the reality would have become harder to deny. The roads were not simply behind schedule. They were overwhelmed. Interstates were closing. The turnpike had shut. Airports were down. Countless vehicles were stranded or abandoned. In such moments, the city's clock changes. Ordinary time, with appointments and errands and office hours, is replaced by emergency time. People ask different questions. Who is stuck? Who made it home? Which roads are closed? Where can medical staff be transported? How far did the plows get? Can fuel reach that neighbourhood? Is there power in that building? Once roads stop being reliable, almost every other system becomes harder to operate, and the stillness that follows is strange because it is not peaceful. A city brought to stillness by snow is sometimes imagined as picturesque, even comforting. Streets empty, houses warm, a temporary hush. That is not the kind of stillness Cleveland faced on January 26th. This was anxious stillness, functional stillness. The sort that comes with radio reports, idling engines, rescue efforts, blocked lanes, and families waiting to hear whether someone made it through. There is nothing soft about a city stopping because it no longer trusts the roads. It is stillness full of friction. Everything that would normally be flowing is now backed up inside homes, emergency offices, garages, fire stations, and stranded vehicles. One of the reasons these storms stay alive in memory is that cars are such intimate spaces. A person may not remember the exact barometric pressure, but they remember gripping a steering wheel and seeing nothing beyond a few feet of white. They remember the moment the car stopped moving in traffic that felt less like traffic than a stalled procession. They remember deciding whether to keep the heater on, whether to crack a window, whether the tailpipe might be getting blocked by drifting snow, whether leaving the vehicle was smarter or more dangerous. Cars in blizzards become little private theatres of uncertainty. Outside, the storm is regional. Inside, it is very personal. The same is true of freeways. In daily life, they feel anonymous and functional. During a blizzard, they become memorable in a way that side streets rarely do because they gather so many people into the same exposure. One blocked freeway lane can hold commuters, truck drivers, families, workers on their way to a shift, salesmen, delivery drivers, and people who simply thought the main road would be safest. When that freeway stops, all those separate lives are held in one ribbon of weather. That is why the photographs and stories from the blizzard so often return to roads lined with half-buried vehicles. They are visual proof of the moment when private routines became one collective stoppage. And still, once the motion stops, the city does not stop needing things. Hospitals still need nurses and doctors. Fire stations still need access. food and fuel still need to move. That is why the National Weather Service notes that in many communities a snowplow was parked at each fire station to clear the snow ahead of the fire truck if a fire broke out. It is an almost grimly practical image. The city, unable to trust the roads generally, begins assigning route-clearing resources directly to the places where delay cannot be tolerated. That is what a road crisis looks like when it reaches the level of public safety rather than inconvenience. So when we talk about Cleveland being brought to stillness, it is not just a dramatic phrase. It is a literal description of what happened when cars, freeways, drifts and whiteout conditions met a city that normally depended on constant motion. Vehicles were abandoned, highways closed, cleanup was blocked by the very objects the roads had trapped. The state leaned on the guard, on volunteers, on helicopters, on snowmobiles, and on whatever else still moved. Ordinary city rhythm gave way to emergency improvisation, and because roads are the arteries of daily life, once they closed or filled, everything else began feeling narrower, slower, and more fragile. That is where the story naturally moves next, because once people are stranded and the roads are failing, the blizzard stops being a transportation story alone. It becomes a rescue story, a shelter story, and a long-hour story, with families, crews, volunteers and emergency workers all trying to get through a city and a state that had been pinned down by wind, cold and snow before anyone had properly finished the first cup of coffee. Once the roads stop working, a storm becomes a different kind of problem. Before that point, people still think in terms of travel, delays, detours, slow traffic, a difficult drive, maybe a cancelled appointment. But when the roads are no longer trustworthy, and when enough cars have already been trapped inside the weather, the whole mood changes. The question is no longer how to get where you are going. The question becomes how to get people out of where they are. That shift happened very quickly in Ohio during the blizzard of January 26, 1978. By then, the state was not just cold and snow-covered. It was fragmented into pockets of isolation, with stranded motorists, blocked towns, overwhelmed plough routes, and basic services struggling to reach the people who needed them. Official National Weather Service histories say transportation, business, schools, and ordinary activity across Ohio were halted for days, while many roads in parts of the state remained impassable until Monday, January 30th. That is when rescue stops sounding like an extraordinary word and starts sounding like daily administration. Not dramatic rescues in the storybook sense, though there were certainly dramatic moments, but rescue as a basic civic function. Who is stuck on a highway? Which hospital cannot get enough staff in? Which nursing home needs supplies? Which family has lost heat? Which rural road is buried too deeply for the normal county equipment? Which drivers are still sitting in vehicles? Which small communities have effectively been cut off? A storm of this scale does not create one single disaster site. It creates thousands of smaller ones at once, scattered across a region that can no longer move through itself normally. Ohio's response reflected that scale. The Ohio National Guard later reported that more than 5,000 Guard members were called to duty during the storm and its aftermath, while helicopters flew roughly 2,700 missions statewide. Those missions were not symbolic. They moved doctors and nurses, rescued stranded residents and motorists, and carried food and medicine into places that road transport could not reliably reach. Thousands of volunteers with snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles also joined the response. That combination of Guard units, air support, and local improvisation tells you how badly the normal map had broken down. When an entire state starts leaning on helicopters, snowmobiles, and volunteer four-wheel drives, it is admitting that its ordinary mobility system has been knocked off the board for a while. That response would have felt both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. Reassuring because help was clearly being mobilized. Unsettling because the form of the help told people how serious the storm had become. A city plough on a bad winter morning is normal. National Guard helicopters ferrying medical personnel is not normal. It is the sort of image that immediately tells a region that the weather has surpassed the range of what normal procedures were built to absorb, and in a way, That is one of the defining features of the blizzard of 1978. It did not simply stress Ohio's systems, it forced them to reorganize around emergency logic. Cleveland was part of that larger emergency picture, but the feeling of the rescue phase can be understood best by thinking about how many different forms of isolation the storm created. There were motorists trapped on highways and freeways. There were neighborhoods dealing with power outages. There were hospitals needing staff transported. There were nursing homes and elderly residents cut off by drifts. There were smaller communities and rural areas where road crews could not keep up with the speed at which snow and wind were rebuilding the problem. The National Weather Service Cleveland office notes that in some communities a snowplow was parked at every fire station, so that if a fire broke out, the plow could go first and clear a path for the truck. That is an astonishingly practical detail, and it shows how rescue in a blizzard is not one grand operation. It is 1,000 small root problems that all have to be solved in a landscape that no longer wants to provide routes. And then there were the stranded motorists themselves, which may be the most emotionally immediate image of the storm. Cleveland Magazine's retrospective says hundreds of motorists abandoned their cars on Cleveland roads, while broader National Weather Service summaries note that many individuals across northern Ohio were stranded in their vehicles, and that some communities were effectively cut off from immediate road assistance. A car in a blizzard is a peculiar kind of half-shelter. It protects you from the direct force of the wind for a time. It gives you a seat, a heater, a roof, and a feeling of enclosure. But it also limits your options. Fuel runs down. Visibility remains poor. Snowdrifts can build around the vehicle. The tailpipe can become obstructed if the storm keeps packing snow in around the back of the car. And every decision starts to feel provisional. Stay with the car. Leave the car. Keep the engine running. Shut it off to save fuel. Crack a window. Wait for help. Try to walk. None of those choices feels clean when the world outside has become a blowing, frozen blank. That is why rescues in storms like this are often less dramatic than they are patient. People imagine sudden extraction. In reality, there is a lot of locating, reaching, identifying, checking, ferrying, and repeating. Someone hears of a stranded family. Someone gets a report of workers stuck at a plant. A volunteer with a snowmobile knows a route that might still be passable. A guard helicopter can land near a hospital or a cleared space, but not necessarily at every doorstep. A county crew manages to break open one road, then discovers the next stretch has drifted closed again. Rescue during a blizzard is usually not fast enough to feel cinematic. It is a matter of grinding through distance that has become newly expensive, and the distances really had become expensive. A few miles on a map might require a helicopter, a tracked vehicle, or a chain of handoffs between local equipment and state support. In ordinary weather, people think of distance primarily in time, 15 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. In a storm like this, distance becomes a question of terrain and exposure. Can anything get there at all? How many drifts are between here and there? Is the road only hidden, or has it become unusable? Are there vehicles blocking the way beneath the snow? Is the wind still too severe to see enough to operate safely? Once those questions take over, rescue becomes as much about access as urgency. There is something else worth noticing about the long rescue phase of the blizzard, which is how much it depended on improvisation outside formal systems. Thousands of civilian volunteers with snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles took part in Ohio's response, according to Ohio Memory. That is a familiar pattern in severe winter weather, especially in regions where people own equipment designed for rough conditions. The official system never truly operates alone. It leans on local knowledge, personal machinery, and the willingness of ordinary people to answer extraordinary conditions with practical help. Somebody knows where the drifts usually form on a back road. Somebody else has a machine capable of crossing an open field where the road has vanished. Somebody knows which farm lane connects to which small road behind a buried intersection. None of that replaces the guard, the county crews, or the state response, but it often makes the difference between isolation and contact. That volunteer dimension also changes the emotional tone of the storm. For all the fear and inconvenience, blizzards often produce moments of cooperation that people remember almost as vividly as the weather itself. A stranger with a snowmobile becomes the reason medicine arrives. A local resident with a truck becomes the reason someone makes it to a clinic, a shelter, or a relative's house. A neighbour with heat and a working stove becomes the reason a family stops worrying quite so much about the power outage. These are not sentimental details. They are part of how communities survive severe weather. When the main systems slow down or fail, social systems become visible again. Still, none of that removes the stress of the time itself, especially once day gives way to evening. There is something particularly long about a winter night during a weather emergency. Daylight, even grey daylight, at least allows for assessment. People can see the shape of the drifts. They can watch ploughs working or failing to work. They can judge whether a nearby road is partly open or still erased. Night removes those small comforts. The storm is still there, but now it is heard more than seen. Wind presses against walls. Snow hisses across windows. Headlights, if any are moving, appear briefly and then vanish back into the white. Power outages feel larger after dark. Distances feel farther. Waiting becomes harder because the clock seems to move more slowly once there is no longer anything useful to look at outside. The blizzard of 1978 also stretched that feeling because the storm's disruption was not a brief event. The Cleveland National Weather Service office says transportation, business, industry and schools in Ohio were brought to a standstill for 2 days, with normal activity not returning for about 5 days. So people were not settling in for one difficult night and expecting full recovery the next morning. They were entering a longer period of uncertainty, in which rescue, resupply and road clearing all had to continue through conditions that had already overwhelmed the first wave of response. That prolongs everything emotionally. A family can endure a rough evening with the thought that tomorrow will normalise things. It is much harder when the next day is expected to remain restricted, and the day after that is still a question. There is also the matter of medical care, which becomes a central concern in any storm large enough to isolate communities. Ohio Memory's account notes that helicopters transported doctors and nurses, which makes clear that staffing itself became a rescue priority. Hospitals do not stop being hospitals during blizzards. If anything, they become more important. But they depend on people arriving, shifts changing, supplies moving, and patients being able to reach them. A major storm attacks all of those assumptions at once. So part of the rescue story is not just about pulling people out of snow. It is about holding together the services that keep everyone else alive while the roads are failing. That same logic extends to food, fuel, and medicine. Helicopter transport during the blizzard was used to get supplies into areas where ground movement had become too uncertain or too slow. Again, the significance of that cannot be overstated. A road system is the hidden supply chain of everyday life. Groceries do not appear magically. Pharmacies do not restock themselves. Heating fuel does not move without transport. The moment a storm interrupts those flows at scale, rescue becomes partly logistical. It is no longer enough to save a stranded driver. The region also has to think about how to keep ordinary necessities from becoming emergency necessities. And then there is the silence that sometimes follows heavy wind once the main movement of a city has been cut down. Not absolute silence, because storms are noisy, but the altered sound of reduced traffic, fewer engines, fewer human voices outdoors. That change matters on the long Ohio night because it makes the emergency feel larger. Cities usually reassure themselves with motion. Cars passing, doors opening, ploughs rumbling by. In a blizzard severe enough to bring transportation nearly to a halt, those normal noises become less frequent or disappear in stretches, leaving people with the storm and their own thoughts. That can make time feel heavy. Every hour between updates feels longer. Every radio bulletin becomes important. Every knock at the door means something. One of the most haunting details from the Cleveland story is that Mayor Dennis Kucinich was stranded in Washington, and Finance Director Joseph DeGreen had to operate from a City Hall command post as acting mayor during the crisis, according to local historical accounts. There is something very revealing in that fact. Not only were ordinary residents trapped by the storm, but the city's own leadership structure had to function around transportation breakdown. Even authority itself was being rerouted. That is the sort of civic oddity that only shows up when weather has advanced well beyond inconvenience and into true emergency. The long night after the roads failed would also have had a deeply uneven character. For some people, it meant waiting safely indoors, worried but sheltered. For others, it meant working without pause. Utility crews, guard members, hospital staff, plough operators, dispatchers, police, firefighters, radio hosts, local volunteers, and the many people who become the skeleton of emergency response when ordinary systems have begun to jam. For some stranded motorists, it meant waiting in a vehicle or finding their way to a shelter or station. For families with power out, it meant extra blankets, improvised meals, and trying not to let children sense how serious the adults thought the situation was. One storm, many nights within it. That unevenness is important because it keeps the blizzard from becoming a single neat historical image. It was not just a line of buried cars or a skyline hidden behind blowing snow. It was also this long network of practical nighttime problems, each demanding attention. A nursing home needed staff. A child needed medicine. A driver needed to be located. A fire station needed its route cleared first. A hospital needed workers moved in. A road crew needed to know whether the drift ahead was just snow or snow piled over abandoned cars. Rescue in a blizzard is built from these very unglamorous specifics. That is what gives it its weight. At the same time, the rescue phase also reveals the stubbornness of human routine. Even during a full-scale weather emergency, people are still trying to restore ordinary functions. They are not just surviving. They are trying to restart pieces of normal life one route at a time. Open this street, reach that clinic, clear that station, get that nurse in, deliver that food, reconnect those lines. Rescue is not separate from recovery. It is the first awkward stage of recovery, carried out while the storm's consequences are still fully present. And in a state as large as Ohio, with Cleveland as only one part of the wider disaster, that made for a very long stretch of work. The storm had created a map full of interrupted lives, and every interruption needed some kind of answer. Guard units gave one answer, helicopters gave another, snowmobiles gave another, neighbours gave another, local knowledge, county crews, city command posts, radio communication, and sheer persistence all played their part. That is what the long Ohio night really was. Not just darkness after a bad storm, but a period in which an entire region had to improvise movement, shelter, and care while the normal transportation grid remained untrustworthy. And even as those rescues were happening, another part of the storm story was still unfolding in Cleveland itself, because after the wind had buried roads and the rescue effort had begun to stitch together isolated parts of the city and state, Lake Erie and the weather around it were not finished adding their own signature to the aftermath, which is where the next stretch of the story naturally leads, to the strange persistence of Great Lakes winter after the main blow has passed, and to the way Cleveland's geography made sure that even once the worst of the storm had moved on, the weather still had more to say. One of the awkward truths about Great Lakes winter is that a storm does not always end when people most want it to. The main low can move on. The pressure can begin to recover. The headlines can start speaking in the past tense. But along Lake Erie, that does not automatically mean the weather has finished interfering with ordinary life. In the case of the blizzard of 1978, official National Weather Service summaries say the worst storm in Ohio history struck before dawn on Thursday, January 26th, and then continued through Thursday and into Friday, with transportation, schools, businesses and industry shut down statewide for 2 days, and the normal pace of society not returning for about 5 days. That matters because it tells you the event was not one violent morning followed by neat recovery. Cleveland and the rest of northern Ohio still had to live with what came after the main blow. For Cleveland, the afterpart of a winter storm is never just cleanup. The city sits on Lake Erie, and that means the lake keeps participating, even when people would very much prefer it to stop. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History notes that true blizzards are not frequent in Cleveland, but heavy winter snowstorms are normal because of the proximity of Lake Erie and lake effect snows. That one line says a great deal. Cleveland does not deal with winter only as a city on land. It deals with winter as a city beside a very large body of water that can keep feeding weather after the main synoptic system has already done its worst. So the blizzard did not end in a simple way. It moved from one kind of punishment into another, from explosive storm force disruption into the slower, more local and very familiar Great Lakes habit of lingering snow, cold and repeated difficulty. Lake effect snow is not mysterious, but it is very effective. NOAA explains that it forms when cold, below freezing air moves over comparatively warmer lake water. The lake gives heat and moisture to the lower atmosphere. The air rises, cools, and then dumps snow downwind. The National Weather Service safety page says the same process can build narrow bands capable of producing 2 to 3 inches of snow per hour or more when cold Canadian air crosses the open Great Lakes. That is the important part for a city like Cleveland. Once the main storm drags very cold air in behind it, the lake can turn from a dark winter backdrop into an active snow machine. The central low may be gone, but the setup for additional localized snowfall can remain very much alive. That's exactly why the aftermath of a Great Lakes blizzard feels different from the aftermath of many inland storms. Inland, people may wake after the worst weather to a quieter landscape and begin the straightforward work of digging out. Along Lake Erie, the digging out can be interrupted by new bands of snow generated by the cold air that the storm itself dragged in. The Cleveland National Weather Service page on the blizzard of 1978 points out that cold air quickly filled in behind the storm as it moved north of the area, and NOAA's lake effect explanation makes clear what such a setup usually means over an unfrozen lake. Even when the worst synoptic winds begin to ease, cold air over relatively warmer water favours fresh cloud and snow development downwind. In other words, the storm leaves and then hands part of its job to the lake. That last point is an inference from the documented cold air surge behind the storm plus standard lake effect physics, but it fits the Cleveland setting very closely. It also helps explain why Clevelanders and other Northeast Ohio residents would not have experienced Friday as a clean emotional reset. The official summary says the blizzard continued into Friday, and much of the state remained shut down for days. So imagine the mental rhythm of that. People spend Thursday waking into a city erased by whiteout and wind. Rescue operations begin. Roads fail. Cars are abandoned. Power is out in many places. Then, instead of reaching Friday with a calm, crisp after, the region is still in it. The central violence may have peaked, but the air remains bitter. The drifts remain enormous. And in the lake-influenced areas, the atmosphere still has enough fuel to keep snow showers and squalls in the picture. That prolongs not only the cleanup, but the fatigue. The first day of a disaster is full of adrenaline. The second day is often where the scale of the work truly sinks in. There is another reason the lake matters after the main blow. Lake effect snow is localized in a way that can make a region feel unevenly trapped. NOAA and the National Weather Service both describe lake effect snow as something that often falls in narrow, intense bands. That means one place can be merely cold and unsettled while another, not very far away, is being hammered by persistent snow showers. Anybody who has lived around the lower Great Lakes understands that frustration. You can hear that the storm is over, and that can be true in the broad synoptic sense, while a specific corridor south or east of Lake Erie is still getting buried by the lake's own follow-up act. This local unevenness is one of the reasons Great Lakes storms remain maddening after the headlines simplify. The region does not recover as one neat block. It recovers in patches, roads, counties and neighbourhoods, some of them under continued snow. For Cleveland specifically, that unevenness is built into geography. The city itself, the near west side, the near east side, and the higher terrain farther inland do not all receive the same weather from the lake once bands set up. That pattern is familiar to modern forecasters, and the Cleveland National Weather Service's current and historical event pages repeatedly distinguish the snowbelt areas south and east of Lake Erie from the metrocore because lake effect snow can linger there after broader snowfall has weakened. Even the 2026 and 2024 local event summaries use that exact framework. Widespread snow tapers, then lingering lake effect snow showers continue in the snow belt, while other places improve first. Those are modern events, not 1978, but they illustrate the local mechanism very clearly and show how Northeast Ohio still behaves in the same basic way. That makes it entirely reasonable to understand the 1978 aftermath in those practical terms. In Cleveland, storm over often means storm over here first, maybe. And that would have been maddening for crews already trying to clear a city and region crippled by drifts. Cleanup in a normal snowstorm is a problem of volume. Cleanup after a blizzard with lake influence is a problem of volume plus persistence. The National Weather Service summary says huge drifts shut down movement, that roads in many parts of Ohio were not passable until Monday, January 30th, and that much of the state was shut down for several days while Ohioans laboured to clear roads, driveways and sidewalks. If lingering snow showers continue in some areas while the deepest drifts are still being attacked, then ploughing becomes less like a straight line from block to open and more like a tug of war. You clear one section, the wind has already reshaped another, and in the lake belt you may still have fresh snow adding insult to the job. The lake effect also affects mood because it keeps the sky from offering emotional closure. After a storm, people want visual reassurance, sunlight, better visibility, a horizon that looks trustworthy again. Even plain grey but steady weather can feel like relief if it behaves predictably. Lake effect snow refuses that kind of neat ending. It can arrive in bursts. It can thin, then return. It can make 1 hour look manageable and the next hour look like winter has decided to start over. When you have already lived through the worst blizzard in state history, that kind of stop-start snowfall carries a special irritation. Nobody needs the atmosphere to prove that it still has ideas. By Friday, people in and around Cleveland would likely have been less interested in meteorological distinctions than in the simple question of whether the sky was finally finished interfering with the shovel, the plough, and the road back to normal life. It is also worth remembering that Lake Erie was not just a source of snow bands in the aftermath. During the storm itself, the lake had already shown how exposed the region was. The Cleveland National Weather Service anniversary page notes a report from Burton Ayres, stranded in thick Lake Erie ice off Sandusky, of sustained winds of 86 miles per hour and gusts to 111 miles per hour on Thursday morning. That detail belongs mainly to the storm's violent peak, but it also reminds us that the lakefront and open water environment were not passive scenery during this event. Lake Erie was part of the weather structure and part of the region's vulnerability. Even after the strongest winds eased, the lake remained physically present as a source of cold, localized snow and practical anxiety for places downwind. Then there is the issue of cold itself. The blizzard of 1978 brought not just snow and wind, but a hard shove of Arctic air that stayed in place after the main pressure center had passed. The Cleveland anniversary material says temperatures fell to near zero as the blizzard began and remained near 10 degrees for most of the day, with wind chills below minus 50 degrees all day. Even where snowfall was no longer dramatic, that kind of cold slows everything. Cars remain difficult. Fuel use stays high. Crews tire faster. Snow is not slushy and pliable, but dry, rigid, and often more difficult to break up in deeply packed drifts. A cold aftermath is not a pause between disasters. It is part of the same disaster, because it keeps roads dangerous, homes vulnerable, and outdoor labour punishing. That cold also helped preserve the storm's mess. People sometimes imagine post-storm cleanup in terms of melting. but there was very little comfort in that direction immediately after the blizzard of 1978. With temperatures having collapsed from the 40s into the single digits in Cleveland, there was no quick thaw to soften the piles, expose buried cars, or turn the drifts into something easier to attack. Instead, the city and the wider region were left with frozen evidence of the storm everywhere. Cleveland Magazine later described street-parked and abandoned cars buried beneath mounds of snow and city crews, forced to dig them out and tow them away one by one. That is not the kind of work that speeds up when the weather remains bitter and the lakeside of the region may still be dealing with additional snow showers. There is a specific Great Lakes unfairness in that sequence. First, the storm knocks the city flat with blizzard conditions and record low pressure. Then, when the storm centre leaves, the lake keeps local snow going and the cold locks everything in place. Nothing becomes easier all at once. It eases in layers, and some layers ease more slowly than others depending on where you are. That's one reason people in northeast Ohio remember winter storms not just as one event, but as a stretch of days. The official Cleveland summary explicitly says the normal pace of society did not return for about 5 days. 5 days is long enough for a disaster to stop feeling like an interruption and start feeling like a temporary mode of life. The lake effect also complicates storytelling because it is less theatrical than the main blow. The overnight collapse of the sky, the stranded cars, the howling wind, the abandoned freeways, those are easy to picture. Lingering post-storm snowbands and repeated local bursts of snow are quieter, but they may be just as important to how a region actually experiences the aftermath. They wear people down, they prolong school closures, they keep side roads suspect, they make it harder to say with confidence that conditions are improving everywhere. And that is very much a Lake Erie kind of nuisance. A big storm can leave, the lake does not. In practical terms, this meant recovery around Cleveland and northeast Ohio would have been unevenly paced and annoyingly local. One area might finally get a road reopened and a sense of progress, while another farther east or in higher terrain remained under active snow showers. One family might hear that highways were beginning to improve, while their own neighbourhood still sat under drifts and blowing snow. One employer might reopen sooner than an employee's route could responsibly support. Great Lakes winter is very good at producing those mismatches. The broad map improves before every local map does. Lake effect is part of the reason why. There is also a cultural side to this. People who live far from the Great Lakes sometimes imagine a storm as one big thing with one beginning and one end. People around Lake Erie learn a fussier lesson. The broad storm can end and the local winter can continue. Forecast language reflects that even now. Widespread snow tapers, then lake effect lingers. That modern phrasing appears in Cleveland weather summaries because it is a recurring pattern in the region. So when thinking about 1978, it is not enough to remember the huge low-pressure system and the statewide emergency. It is also necessary to remember the smaller, more local weather logic that came behind it, because that is how Cleveland actually lives with winter. Not in one grand scene, but in a series of practical annoyances layered on top of each other until the roads finally reluctantly begin to act like roads again. The lake's role after the main storm also helps explain why memory of the blizzard in Cleveland is so tied to persistence rather than a single snowfall number. Officially, Cleveland's storm snowfall was significant, but not the largest on record by simple total. What made the event unforgettable was the combination of explosive cyclonic development, extreme wind, plunging temperatures, deep drifts, transportation collapse, power outages, and then a slow recovery in a place where lake effect snow is always waiting to prolong winter trouble. In that sense, Lake Erie did not create the blizzard of 1978 by itself, but it absolutely belonged to the atmosphere that Cleveland had to keep living under after the main blow. That is why "after the blow" is a useful phrase here. It suggests something many weather stories leave out: the part after the headline peak, when people are tired, the roads are still uncertain, the city is still off rhythm, and the local geography keeps insisting that recovery will happen on Great Lakes terms rather than on human ones. Along Lake Erie, winter has a habit of lingering in practical ways. The blizzard of 1978 was the grand disaster. The lake effect after it was the reminder that even once the worst has passed, Cleveland still has to negotiate with the water beside it, the cold behind it, and the snow that can keep arriving after everyone is already worn out. And that lingering quality matters for what comes next in the story, because by the time the lake has added its own afterword, the storm is no longer just an event on the calendar. It has settled into memory. It has become one of those regional experiences people measure later winters against, which is exactly where the next part belongs, in the way the blizzard of 78 stayed with Cleveland long after the roads reopened. The drifts were cut back, and the city resumed its normal routines. Some storms pass into history because they were large. Others stay because they interrupted life so completely that people never stopped measuring later winters against them. The blizzard of 1978 belongs to that second category in Cleveland. It is not remembered only because it was severe, though it certainly was. It is remembered because it rearranged the city's sense of what winter could do. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History still describes it as the worst blizzard in Cleveland history, and the Cleveland office of the National Weather Service continues to mark its anniversaries with dedicated retrospectives and archival material. That alone tells you something. This is not just a storm in an old newspaper file. It is an event Cleveland keeps returning to because it became one of the city's reference points for danger, disruption, and winter memory. Part of the reason it stayed so firmly in local memory is that it struck right at the point where routine is supposed to begin. The storm reached Cleveland in its full force, around the hours when workers would normally be getting ready to leave, and the city did not gradually adjust to that reality. It woke inside it. The National Weather Service says the low crossed Ohio overnight, and blizzard conditions reached Cleveland by about 7 a.m. The encyclopedia entry says the eye reached Cleveland around 4 to 5 a.m. That timing matters more than it might first seem. A city hit in the middle of the day still has a chance to watch the crisis arriving. Cleveland's crisis got there first and waited in the dark for everyone to open the curtains. That kind of beginning tends to stay with people. It also stayed because the physical measurements were so extreme that they became part of local identity. Cleveland's barometric pressure dropped to about 28.28 inches, still the lowest pressure ever recorded in Ohio, according to the National Weather Service. The encyclopedia entry gives the local record as 28.26 inches, reflecting a slightly different historical reporting convention, but the point is the same. The pressure was extraordinary, and it broke into the realm of numbers people repeat decades later because they sound almost unreasonable. Add in sustained winds above 50 miles per hour, gusts to 82 in Cleveland, a temperature drop of roughly 39 degrees in 6 hours, and zero visibility at Hopkins, and you have the sort of weather profile that no longer feels like a bad storm. It feels like a benchmark. But raw numbers alone do not explain why a city keeps talking about one storm for nearly half a century. Plenty of places have records. What keeps the blizzard of 78 alive in Cleveland is that it joined those records to ordinary life in a very intimate way. Cleveland Magazine's retrospective notes that many Ohioans did not even realize how bad things were until their electric alarm clocks failed to wake them on the morning of January 26th. That is such a specific detail, and perhaps that is why it works so well. The storm was not only dramatic from the outside. It entered the day through bedrooms, kitchens, and darkened houses. It cut across the small machinery of routine, and that is how events become family stories. Nobody needs to remember the exact pressure reading to remember waking late because the power was out, and then discovering that going anywhere had become a very silly idea. That same article in Cleveland Magazine says the blizzard was remembered in 1997 as one of the 25 biggest moments of the last 25 years. When the magazine looked back over its first quarter century, that is a revealing choice. Cleveland has had political battles, economic shocks, sports heartbreaks, industrial changes, and all the other ingredients that make up a city's modern history. Yet the blizzard still ranked as one of the moments worth naming. Not a weather footnote, a moment. That is what happens when a storm becomes more than meteorology and starts functioning as a shared civic memory. The snow did not simply fall on Cleveland. It became part of how Cleveland remembered itself in the late 20th century. The storm also stayed because it exposed a weakness that modern cities do not like being reminded of. One of the Cleveland National Weather Service anniversary pages compares the blizzard of 1978 with earlier great blizzards and makes a very blunt point. There was less overall disruption of society in 1918 than in 1978, because modern life had become more dependent on cars and electricity. That observation is almost more unsettling now than it was then. Cleveland in 1978 was not defeated because people had forgotten winter. It was defeated because a modern city depends on hidden systems functioning in sequence. Roads must remain roads. Power must stay on. Workers must be able to move. Trucks must continue arriving. The blizzard exposed how much ordinary life depends on those assumptions, and how quickly a single storm can take them away. That exposure made the blizzard feel bigger than weather. The National Weather Service still calls it the worst winter storm in Ohio history. Ohio memory says the people who experienced it will never forget it. Major General James C. Clem famously described the transportation impact as comparable to a nuclear attack, at least in terms of statewide paralysis. Those phrases are strong, but they are not just rhetorical flourishes. They reflect the fact that the storm disrupted transportation, commerce, schooling, and emergency services on a statewide scale, while Cleveland itself lost power to more than 110,000 homes, and saw roads, freeways, and ordinary movement collapse almost at once. A city does not forget very easily when its entire operational confidence is broken in public. There is also the matter of the way the blizzard looked. That sounds almost trivial next to fatalities and state emergencies, but it is not trivial at all when it comes to memory. Cleveland did not receive the largest simple snowfall total of all time during this storm. The encyclopedia entry gives the local snowfall at about 8 inches, while Cleveland Magazine's retelling speaks of about 6 inches in 12 hours. What made the blizzard unforgettable was not only how much snow fell, but what the wind did with it. Drifts made roads impassable. Cars were abandoned throughout the area. Some roads were edged by walls of moved snow rather than a neat blanket of accumulation. It is much easier to forget a storm that merely covered things. It is harder to forget a storm that reshaped them. Cars, in particular, help explain why the storm never really left the city's imagination. In Cleveland Magazine's account, nearly 1,000 unclaimed autos had to be towed to lots after the storm, while official summaries note that whole semis could be buried in the drifts in northern Ohio. The image of vehicles stuck, abandoned and gradually hidden beneath moved snow has a special staying power in a place built around road travel. Cars are ordinary. That is precisely why they work so well as memory anchors. Everybody knows what a parked car looks like. Everybody knows what a freeway is supposed to do. So when a storm makes both of those things look absurdly fragile, the memory remains vivid. Buried church steeples would be striking certainly, but buried sedans and stopped turnpikes tell a more intimate truth about modern life. The blizzard stayed because it turned leaders, institutions and ordinary citizens into part of the same emergency story. The encyclopedia entry notes that Mayor Dennis Kucinich was stuck in Washington and could not return, leaving Finance Director Joseph DeGreen to set up a command post as acting mayor. Ohio's governor declared a statewide emergency and activated the National Guard. More than 5,000 Guard members were called up, and helicopters flew thousands of missions. Cities and counties leaned on volunteers with snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles. When that much official and unofficial machinery has to be redirected toward the same weather event, the storm stops being an interruption and starts feeling like a historic test. Cleveland did not experience the blizzard of '78 as a dramatic backdrop. It experienced it as a full civic mobilization. And then there is the emotional side, which tends to outlive the statistics. Ohio Memory notes that people who lived through the storm never forgot it. That makes sense, because severe weather is remembered through ordinary events being unexpectedly cancelled, damaged, or prolonged. Birthdays are postponed, work shifts turn into ordeals. School disappears for days, relatives cannot reach one another. A person who was a child at the time may remember no school and giant drifts. A person who was an adult may remember trying to get home or trying to keep the heat on. The Cleveland article about the blizzard makes plain that shelters had to be opened and that many homes lost power. Once a storm has entered both childhood memory and adult responsibility at the same time, it gets handed down in stories almost automatically. That handoff from direct memory to inherited memory is one of the main reasons the blizzard never really left. A younger Clevelander may not have lived through January 1978, but they still encounter it through family talk, anniversary coverage, archive photographs, and comparisons during later storms. The National Weather Service Cleveland office has built detailed anniversary pages. The Ohio History and Ohio Memory institutions still publish retrospective material, and Case Western Reserve continues to place the blizzard in local historical context. When official and cultural institutions keep revisiting the same storm, they help move it from lived experience into regional tradition. It becomes one of those things that belongs not only to the people who were there, but to the place itself. A storm also stays alive when it becomes the standard for comparison. You can hear that in the way later winter events are still discussed around northeast Ohio. Even recent local weather coverage frames new storms against 1978, asking how they compare and usually concluding that the crucial difference is wind. Search results from WKYC and News 5. Cleveland in recent years explicitly compared new winter storms to the blizzard of 78, emphasizing that later events might have more snow or similar cold, but lack the same mix of wind, drifting, and statewide paralysis. That tells you something very simple. Cleveland still uses 1978 as the ruler. New storms do not stand alone. They are measured against the one that already owns the category. The wind factor matters especially because it keeps the blizzard from being reduced to a comforting misunderstanding. A lot of people outside the region hear blizzard and imagine a lot of snow and perhaps a nostalgic sort of winter drama. Cleveland's memory resists that simplification. The official sources keep stressing the same features: hurricane-force gusts, whiteout, drifting, record low pressure, closed freeways, lost power, and prolonged shutdown. That repeated emphasis keeps the story practical rather than picturesque. In other words, Cleveland did not remember the blizzard of 78 as charmingly snowy. It remembered it as a system-wide failure delivered by weather. That is not the kind of thing nostalgia softens very much. Another reason it never left is that it fit perfectly into the city's existing relationship with winter, while still exceeding it. Cleveland is not Miami waking to the shock of snow. It is a lake city with a long history of hard winters and lake effect trouble. The encyclopedia entry places the 1978 blizzard inside that broader tradition, mentioning earlier major Cleveland storms and still calling 1978 the worst. That comparison is important because it means the blizzard did not become famous merely because the city lacked winter experience. It became famous because it surpassed what local winter experience had prepared people for. When a place used to snow says, "No, this one was different," the statement carries more weight. The blizzard also left a permanent lesson about timing. It is one thing for a storm to arrive in the afternoon and force people home. It is another for it to deepen overnight, cut power, shut visibility down, and meet the city at the exact moment daily life is trying to start. That timing gave the storm a peculiar intimacy. It entered the home before it entered the road. It was in the silent alarm clock before it was in the plough report. It was in the morning window before it was in the official declaration. That sequence helps explain why the storm still feels vivid in recollection. People did not meet it as spectators. They met it before coffee, before commuting, before they were fully ready to reason with it. there is a broader cultural reason too. Cities like Cleveland build identity partly through endurance. Factories, lake wind, losing seasons, hard winters, long recoveries, stubborn routines. The blizzard of '78 fit that culture in a way that guaranteed it would be retold. It was a story of a city getting knocked down by something undeniable, and then digging out, improvising, and comparing every later challenge to that benchmark. The storm may have immobilized the state, but the memory it left behind became oddly useful. It gave Cleveland a standard answer to later weather bravado. You think this is bad? You should have seen '78. Every region has one or two events like that. Cleveland's just happens to come with an absurdly low barometer and a freeway system that briefly forgot its purpose. Even now, the way institutions write about the blizzard shows that it remains present rather than archived. The National Weather Service Cleveland office has anniversary pages, image collections, and educational summaries devoted to it. Ohio memory still frames it as the storm that people who experienced it will never forget. Case Western still catalogues it as a defining local blizzard. This is not merely clerical preservation, it is active remembrance. The city and region keep teaching the storm to new readers, new residents, and younger generations. And when a place continues teaching a disaster, the disaster is no longer gone in any meaningful cultural sense. It has become part of how the place explains itself. So the blizzard of '78 never really left Cleveland because it joined everything required for permanence. It had scale, it had records, it had striking images, it had family-level consequences, it exposed modern vulnerability, it forced civic improvisation, it disrupted the rhythm of the city so thoroughly that later storms still have to introduce themselves by comparison. Most weather passes and leaves behind a number or two. This one left behind a vocabulary: buried cars, dead alarm clocks, shut turnpike, lost power, whiteout, near hurricane wind. If a storm gives a city that many lasting reference points, then it does not really go away when the snow finally melts. It stays where local memory stores the things that are both terrible and useful, the stories people return to when they want to explain what winter can do here, and why nobody in Cleveland entirely laughs off a hard January forecast. And once a storm has settled that deeply into local memory, the only place left to go is quieter. Not into the mechanics of the weather anymore, and not into the logistics of rescue, but into the way a place continues to listen to an old event long after it is over, which is where the final part belongs, in that soft after space where history stops being only facts and becomes a voice the city still seems to hear whenever the lake wind rises and the snow starts moving sideways again. And so, here we are at the end of this long winter road, standing a little farther along than when we began, with Cleveland behind us, Lake Erie behind that, and one January storm still making itself known all these years later. We have followed it from a normal winter evening into a night of falling pressure, from that overnight collapse into a morning so white and windstruck that roads stopped behaving like roads, and from there into stranded cars, blocked freeways, guard helicopters, drifting rescue routes, and the slow, stubborn work of getting a city and a state back on their feet. It was not just a snowstorm. It was, as the National Weather Service still describes it, the worst winter storm in Ohio history. And in Cleveland, it remains the blizzard people still compare other blizzards to. That alone tells you something important. Storms come and go. Winter keeps making promises it has no intention of keeping. Forecasts are read, boots are found, salt is scattered, and life goes on. But every so often a storm arrives that does more than interrupt a day. It changes the way a place thinks. The blizzard of 1978 did that to Cleveland. It showed in a very practical and very rude way that a city could know winter well and still be caught off guard by winter pushed far beyond its usual range. Cleveland was not unprepared because it was inexperienced. Cleveland was overwhelmed because the storm was exceptional. The pressure fell to a state record low. The wind reached 82 miles per hour in the city. Temperatures crashed, visibility disappeared, transportation across Ohio shut down so severely that normal life did not return for about 5 days. And that is probably the first thing the Superbomb still says, if we can allow it a voice at all. It says that familiarity is useful but not unlimited. A winter city learns confidence for good reason. That confidence helps people function through the ordinary ugliness of January. It helps them get to work, get children to school, keep businesses running, and treat bad weather as something to be managed rather than feared. But the blizzard of '78 reminded Cleveland that experience has an edge, and beyond that edge the atmosphere stops respecting routine. There comes a point where local toughness is no longer enough, where roads vanish, power fails, airports close, and the only honest response is to admit that the weather has taken control for a while. That lesson is not really old-fashioned either. If anything, it feels more modern now. We like to imagine that better radar, stronger forecasting, more capable vehicles, and bigger response systems have made us less vulnerable to weather. In some ways, yes, of course they have. Forecasting is far better now than it was in 1978. Communication is faster. Emergency management is more coordinated. People can see warnings instantly rather than waiting for a television bulletin or radio update. But the basic weakness the blizzard exposed is still with us. Modern life depends on movement and electricity. If a storm damages both at once, a great many sophisticated things suddenly become very simple. Can you leave the house? Can a nurse reach the hospital? Can a plough see the road? Is the heat still on? Are the main routes open? Those are old questions, but they remain stubbornly current. That is another reason the storm never really left Cleveland. It stayed relevant. Local institutions still remember it. Case Western's Encyclopedia of Cleveland History still calls it the worst blizzard in the city's history. The National Weather Service in Cleveland still keeps anniversary pages and photo archives devoted to it. Local media still compare major snow and wind events back to 1978 to explain scale and seriousness. That is what happens when one weather event becomes the measuring stick. It does not stay trapped in the year it happened. It becomes part of how later storms are understood. And then there are the personal memories, which are often the most durable kind. Somebody remembers an electrical alarm clock going dark because the power failed overnight. Somebody else remembers a father or mother not making it home on time because the roads had become impossible. Somebody remembers seeing a car almost hidden in snow where a car plainly should not have disappeared. Somebody remembers the sound of the wind around the house. Somebody remembers school vanishing for days, which as a child may have sounded almost magical until the adults' faces made clear that this was not cheerful news. A storm like that settles into a city through thousands of homes at once. It becomes part of family language, not just the storm, but the blizzard of '78. With capital letters in the voice even when there are none on the page. It also left behind a practical kind of respect. After enough years, respect can sound like folklore, but it is more useful than that. People in and around Cleveland still know that a forecast involving strong wind matters differently there than a forecast involving snow alone. They know Lake Erie can keep trouble going after the main system has moved on. They know a winter storm is not defined only by totals. They know drifting can be worse than accumulation, and whiteout worse than depth. In other words, the blizzard taught the region how to read danger a little more accurately. A place does not always learn from weather in a neat formal way, but it does learn. It remembers which combination of conditions caused the real trouble. In this case, the answer was not simply a lot of snow. It was rapid intensification, violent wind, collapsing temperatures, drifting, power loss, and roads that no longer deserved the name. There is something else the storm still says, and it has less to do with fear than with scale. Severe weather has a way of resizing people's sense of themselves. Most days, a city feels large. Cleveland has roads, industry, neighborhoods, lakefront, suburbs, and all the normal confidence of a place built to function. But a storm like this shrinks that confidence quickly. It reminds everyone that the city is not separate from the environment around it. It is sitting inside it. All the buildings, schedules, offices and plans remain dependent on air, temperature, visibility and access. That is not mystical, it is logistical. The blizzard of 78 made that point very clearly. It brought transportation to a standstill, cut power to more than 110,000 homes in Greater Cleveland, and forced a response involving the National Guard, helicopters, command posts, and volunteers with snowmobiles. There is also, quietly, a more reassuring thing in the story. The storm did not only reveal weakness, it revealed capacity. Not the capacity to stop the blizzard, because nobody was stopping that, but the capacity to respond once ordinary systems failed. Plows were deployed, fire stations were prioritised. The Guard flew missions, volunteers answered, neighbours helped neighbours, hospitals kept trying to function, city government improvised around missing leadership and impossible conditions. None of that makes the storm less serious, but it does explain why these stories are still worth telling in a calm voice, rather than only in the language of disaster. They're not just records of what weather destroyed, they're also records of what people did next. And perhaps that is the part that settles in most deeply when you sit with a storm long enough. The numbers are dramatic, yes. The pressure record still astonishes. The wind speeds still sound excessive in the most Midwestern way, as though the atmosphere had decided simple hostility was no longer enough and had to become theatrical about it. But the more enduring part is how human the event remains. It is still made of kitchens, radios, snowbound roads, abandoned cars, plough drivers, stranded workers, and people making practical decisions under bad information in worse conditions. That keeps the blizzard from becoming distant. It never quite drifts away into museum weather. It also explains why later storms still cause people to bring up 1978, often with a mixture of seriousness and local pride. The comparison is not always meant to say every new storm is equal to it. Usually the opposite. The comparison is a way of drawing the boundary. This one is rough, yes, but it is not 78. Or more rarely, this one has a little of that same feeling. It is a language of calibration. Cleveland keeps the blizzard of 78 around because it remains a useful standard for what truly bad winter weather looks like when all the wrong elements arrive together. And now, after following it this far, I think the simplest thing the Superbomb still says across the snow is this. Ordinary life is more delicate than it appears, but people are tougher than they first seem. That sounds almost too tidy, and storms are never tidy, but there is truth in it. The roads failed. The power failed in many homes. The morning routine failed completely. Yet the city did not vanish. The state did not vanish. What vanished was the illusion that systems do not need constant physical help from the world around them. Once that illusion blew away, what remained was work, improvisation, patience, and a very large amount of snow in very inconvenient places. So perhaps the storm's voice is not mysterious after all. It does not whisper anything especially poetic. It says concrete things. Check the forecast. Respect the wind. Do not underestimate drifting. A road can disappear faster than pride can admit. The lake is not decoration. Power matters more than you think. Normal life is a machine with many moving parts, and weather can jam them all before breakfast. These are not romantic messages, but they are honest ones, and storms remembered for decades are usually remembered because they were honest in the rudest possible way. At the same time, memory softens the edges just enough for a city to live with them. People can talk about the blizzard now with a little humour tucked around the seriousness. There is room for the absurdity of a storm named Superbomb, which sounds like the weather equivalent of a wrestler entering an arena under dramatic lights. There is room for the almost unbelievable detail of dead alarm clocks failing to wake people, because the power had already gone out. There is room for the local habit of treating later storms as candidates in a competition they are usually going to lose. Time does that. It leaves the facts in place but makes them easier to hold. And that is probably where a good evening story should end. Not with the storm becoming grander than it was, and not with it shrinking into quaintness, but with it taking up its proper place. One of those rare events that showed a city something true about itself. Cleveland was reminded that winter by the lake is not just background scenery. It is an active relationship. It can be handled until it cannot. It can be joked about until it cannot. And every once in a great while, it produces a day so forceful that decades later, the city still nods toward it when the wind rises and the forecast begins sounding uncomfortably familiar. So, if you're listening now from somewhere cold, I hope your roads are clear, your heat is steady, and the weather outside is behaving itself with at least a little dignity. And if you're listening from somewhere warm, perhaps this has been a comfortable way to visit a place where January once became very unreasonable indeed. Either way, I would love to know where you are tonight and what the weather is doing in your little corner of the world. A quiet rain, a calm sky, a little frost, or perhaps just a completely ordinary evening, which after a story like this can sound like one of the best things on earth. And if you found this journey through Cleveland's great winter catastrophe calming, interesting, or simply a good companion for the end of the day, I would be very grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared it with someone else who might enjoy settling down with a true story told slowly. It helps this small corner of quiet history keep going, and it lets me keep bringing these strange, human, weather-beaten moments to anyone who needs a softer place to put their thoughts for a while. For now, though, the roads are finally behind us. The ploughs can rest. The helicopters have long since landed. The drifts have been cut back, the buried cars dug out, the power restored, and the city returned to itself. But not entirely. A storm like that leaves a shape behind in local memory, and Cleveland still carries it. Somewhere under every later winter warning, somewhere in every comparison to a bad forecast, somewhere in the way older voices say 78 without needing to explain what they mean, the Superbomb is still there. Sleep well, wherever you are, stay warm, and may tomorrow morning be much less interesting than January 26, 1978.